You are not my daughter anymore. You are a debt I am paying." Those were the words Charlotte Whitmore's father said to her face, not in anger, not in secret, but calmly, the way a man signs a check. She was 22 years old. She had done everything right. And still her father looked her in the eye and told her she was worth exactly the amount of money Victor Blackwood was willing to pay. That night, Charlotte made the only choice she had left. She ran. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, follow Charlotte's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The dining room of the Whitmore mansion had always felt cold to Charlotte, not because of the temperature. The fireplace burned every evening from October through March, and the logs her father ordered, stacked along the east wall, were always the best quality. Thick pine, slow burning steady. No, the cold Charlotte felt in that room had nothing to do with the weather outside. It had to do with the man who sat at the head of the table. Richard Whitmore had a way of filling a room that had nothing to do with his size. He was not a tall man. He was not physically imposing. But there was something in the way he held himself. The straight back. The still hands. The eyes that never moved unless he wanted them to. That made every person in his presence feel smaller than they actually were. Charlotte had felt that shrinking her entire life. She was standing outside the dining room door the evening it happened. She had been called in after supper, which was unusual. Richard Whitmore did not make requests. He issued summons. And when the housekeeper, old Margaret, who had worked for the family for 30 years and who had never once looked Charlotte directly in the eye without permission, knocked on her bedroom door and said, "Your father is asking for you in the dining room, Miss Charlotte." The way she said it told Charlotte everything. Something was wrong. She stood outside the door for a moment. She pressed her hand flat against the wood. She could hear her father's voice inside low and measured, speaking to someone she did not recognize. There was another man in there. She could hear the difference in the silence. The way two people occupy a room is different from the way one person does. She pushed the door open. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table as he always did. His hands were folded in front of him. His reading glasses were off. He was not eating. In front of him was a single document face down, and beside him sat a man Charlotte had never seen before, a lawyer, she thought, from the cut of his coat and the leather case sitting open beside his chair. Her father looked up when she entered. He did not smile. He said, "Sit down, Charlotte." She sat. He turned the document over and slid it across the table toward her without a word. Charlotte looked at it. She read the first 3 lines. Then she looked up at her father and said very quietly, "What is this?" "A marriage contract," Richard said. "Read it carefully. You will be signing it tonight." The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your ears. Charlotte set the document down on the table. She pressed her fingertips against its edge. She read it again, more slowly this time, because she needed to be absolutely certain she understood what she was reading. And when she reached the bottom of the page and saw the name printed there, Victor Blackwood, she felt something happen inside her chest that she had never felt before. Not fear, not sadness. Something quieter than both of those. Something with more weight. She looked at her father and said, "Victor Blackwood." Yes. He is 51 years old. He is a very successful man. He has been married twice. Both women were well provided for. Charlotte set the document down. "Father, I am 22 years old." Richard Whitmore unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. "I am aware of how old you are, Charlotte." "Then why?" "Because this family has obligations," he said. His voice did not change. It never changed. That was the thing about Richard Whitmore that was harder to explain than his anger, the fact that he was never angry. He was always perfectly calm. He spoke about things like selling his daughter's future the same way he spoke about ordering new fencing for the north pasture. "We have debts. Victor Blackwood has agreed to clear those debts in exchange for the marriage. The arrangement benefits everyone." Charlotte said, "It does not benefit me." Her father looked at her with an expression she had learned over 22 years to identify as patience running out. He said, "Charlotte." Just her name. Nothing else. But in the way he said it, quiet, flat, absolutely final, was the entire history of her childhood. Every time she had asked a question, he didn't want to answer. Every time she had pushed back against a decision he had already made. Every correction, every dismissal, every moment in which she had tested the invisible walls of her life and found them immovable. He said her name, and he meant, "This is not a conversation." But Charlotte did not look away. She reached out and picked up the document. She held it in both hands. She looked at it for a long moment, the formal language, the legal terms. She mostly understood the line at the bottom, where her signature was supposed to go. And then she set it down on the table, pushed it back across toward her father, and said the words she had been practicing in secret for 3 years. "I am not signing this." The lawyer shifted in his chair. Richard Whitmore did not move. He said, "I beg your pardon." Charlotte said, "I am not signing this contract. I am not marrying Victor Blackwood. And I am not a debt that you can pay with my life." The silence this time was different. It had edges to it. Her father said, "You don't seem to understand the situation." "I understand it perfectly," Charlotte said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. She had been afraid it would shake. It didn't. "You lost money you didn't have. You made an agreement with a man you were afraid of. And now you are trying to solve your problem by selling me." Richard Whitmore's jaw tightened. It was the only movement he made, but Charlotte had learned to read him the way sailors learn to read water, in small signs, quiet warnings, the slight changes that tell you the storm is closer than it looks. He said, "Be very careful." "No," Charlotte said. "You have been telling me to be careful my entire life. You have told me what to wear and who to speak to and how to stand and how to smile and which opinions I am allowed to hold. You have managed every single thing about my existence since I was old enough to understand what management meant. And I have been careful, Father. I have been so careful." Her voice did not waver. "And I am done." Richard Whitmore stood up from his chair. He was not a tall man, but standing. He filled the room differently, and Charlotte felt the old reflex, the one she had been fighting for 3 years, move through her like a current. The impulse to apologize, to soften, to make herself smaller so his anger would have less surface to land on. She didn't. He said, "If you walk away from this agreement, you walk away from everything. No money, no name, no property. You will leave this house with whatever fits in one bag, and you will not come back." Charlotte said, "I know." He stared at her. She met his eyes. He said, "Charlotte, I am your father." And she said quietly, without cruelty, but without flinching, "Yes, you are. And you are looking at your daughter right now and telling her she is worth a dollar amount. So I need you to understand something." She stood up from the chair. "Whatever you think you're saving by selling me to Victor Blackwood, you already lost it. You lost it the moment you thought of me as something you could trade." She walked to the door. Her father's voice came after her. "If you leave this room, Charlotte..." She opened the door. "You have nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing." Charlotte stepped through the doorway and did not look back. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed for exactly 3 minutes, and in those 3 minutes she let herself feel everything she had been holding back in the dining room. The fear, the grief, the strange disorienting weight of having done the thing she had always been too afraid to do. Then she stood up and started packing. She had prepared for this. Not in the way you prepare for something you know is coming, not with certainty, not with a plan, mapped out step by step. But she had prepared the way you prepare for an earthquake in a place where earthquakes happen. You don't know when. You don't know exactly how bad. But you know the ground is not as solid as it looks, and so you think sometimes late at night, if it happens, here is what I do. She pulled the small travel bag from under her bed. Inside it already were a few things she had put there over the past 2 years. A small amount of money, the wages she had earned, helping old Margaret keep household accounts, which her father didn't know she had kept for herself. A change of clothes. A folded letter she had written to herself 3 years ago, when she first understood what her father was planning, which said simply, "Charlotte, you know what you are worth. Do not let him convince you otherwise. Go." She took her mother's necklace from the jewelry box on her dresser. A simple gold chain with a small pearl pendant. It had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that. Her father had tried to sell it twice, and she had hidden it both times. She put it around her neck. She put on her heaviest coat. She picked up the bag. She stood in the middle of her bedroom for one moment and looked at it. The room she had grown up in, the walls she had pressed her ear against as a child to listen to conversations happening below the window. She had climbed out of once at 15 and been caught and spent a month without books as punishment. The room that had been her whole world. Then she turned and walked out of it. The hallway was dark. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when everyone in them is holding their breath. Charlotte moved quickly. She knew the house well enough to move through it in near darkness. She had done it before as a child, sneaking to the kitchen after midnight because she was hungry, and because the act of sneaking felt in some small way like power. She knew which floorboards creaked and where. She knew that the second step of the main staircase would groan if you put your weight on the left side, but was silent if you stepped on the right edge. She made it to the back door without being heard. Outside, the Montana air hit her like a wall, cold and clean and enormous in a way that indoor air never was. She stood in it for 1 second. Just one. She breathed it in. Then she went to the stable. Her horse was a gray mare named Agnes, which was an ugly name for a beautiful animal, and Charlotte had always suspected her father had named her that on purpose, because he named everything in his possession in ways that diminished it. Agnes was 15 hands tall, strong and steady, with a white streak down her nose that she'd had since she was a foal. Charlotte had learned to ride on Agnes. She had spent more hours with this horse than she had with almost any human being in her life. She saddled her quickly and quietly, her fingers working in the dark, the way you work when you have done something 1,000 times and don't need light to do it. Agnes stood still and patient. "I know," Charlotte whispered to her. "I know. I'm sorry it's so early. I'll explain later." Agnes turned her head and looked at her with one large dark eye. Charlotte led her out of the stable and away from the house, walking her slowly until they were far enough from the building that the sound of hooves wouldn't carry back through the windows. Then she mounted and rode. She rode through the Montana dark for most of the night, and the cold was something she had not fully accounted for. She was not unprepared. She had her heavy coat, and she had gloves, and she had learned from years of riding that your body generates its own heat when it's working. But there is a difference between cold you choose and cold that settles into you while you're running, and the cold that pressed against Charlotte on that road was the second kind. She kept riding. She had no destination. That was the part of her preparation that had never quite solidified into a plan. She had known where she was going from with perfect clarity. But the question of where she was going to was hazier, and now in the dark, with the wind against her face, it felt less like freedom and more like falling. She pushed the feeling down. She told herself 1 mile at a time. Just 1 mile at a time. Around 3 in the morning, she heard something behind her. At first, she thought it was the wind. Montana wind has a sound that is almost conversational, almost purposeful, and in the dark, it is easy to hear voices in it. But this sound was different. It was rhythmic. She slowed Agnes and listened. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. Her father had sent men after her already. Charlotte felt the fear arrive in a clean, simple rush. Not the complicated fear she had felt in the dining room, layered with grief and anger and history, but a simple animal fear, the kind that does not require thought. She pressed her heels against Agnes's sides. Agnes ran. She rode through darkness. She couldn't see through, trusting the horse to find solid ground, because Agnes was steadier than any plan Charlotte had and always had been. The sound behind her grew louder, and then faded, and then grew again, and Charlotte could not tell if she was outrunning them or if they had simply taken a different route and were moving to cut her off. She crossed a creek she didn't see until Agnes's hooves were already in the water, and the cold hit her legs, and she gasped, but kept going. She climbed a ridge she hadn't planned on climbing. She lost the road somewhere in the dark and found herself on open land, and for a long moment she genuinely did not know which direction she was moving. She stopped. She made herself stop. Agnes was breathing hard. Charlotte could feel the horse's ribcage expanding and contracting against her legs. She pressed one hand flat against Agnes's neck. She listened. No hoofbeats. Either she had lost them or they had given up for the night. She did not count on the second option. By the time the sky started to lighten, not sunrise, yet just the first gray suggestion of morning at the far edge of the horizon, Charlotte was exhausted in a way she had never been before. Not the tiredness of a long day, not the tiredness of too little sleep. Something deeper and more fundamental. The tiredness of a person who has spent 22 years holding themselves together under pressure, and has just in one night used the last of whatever reserve they had been drawing on. She let Agnes slow to a walk. The landscape around her was different from what she'd started in. She was no longer in Montana, she realized, or not in the part of Montana she knew. The terrain had shifted sometime in the night, and now she was in something more open, more dramatically uneven, and she understood with a start that she had crossed the Wyoming border without realizing it. Wyoming. She had never been to Wyoming. She had never been anywhere her father hadn't sanctioned. She had never, and this hit her with an unexpected force sitting on her horse in the gray pre-dawn light with mud on her boots and exhaustion in every bone. She had never been anywhere at all. She had spent 22 years in the same county, the same house, the same dining room, the same voice telling her what to do. And now she was in Wyoming in the dark, and no one on earth knew exactly where she was. It was the most terrifying feeling she had ever had. It was the most alive she had ever felt. She found the Sullivan Ranch at what she guessed was about 7 in the morning, though she didn't have a way to know for certain. She found it because Agnes found it. The horse had smelled water, or hay, or the particular smell of animals and human habitation, and had started angling toward it without Charlotte directing her, and Charlotte, exhausted and uncertain, had let her go. She saw the fence line first, then the outline of buildings, then smoke rising from a chimney. A ranch, working from the look of it, well maintained. She stopped outside the gate. She thought about what she was doing. She was a woman alone on a horse in a state she had never been in, arriving at a stranger's property in the early morning with one bag and a few dollars and a name she could no longer use in safety. She thought about going back. The thought lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then she pressed her heels against Agnes's sides and rode through the gate. Howe was in the yard when she rode in. She registered him, the way you register any unexpected presence quickly, instinctively cataloging what the eye catches first. He was not old. Somewhere in his 30s, she guessed. He was wearing a worn canvas coat and working gloves, and he had been in the middle of something when she rode through the gate because he had stopped what he was doing and was standing still watching her approach, with a stillness that reminded her for one disorienting second of her father, but only for a second. Because this man's stillness was different. Her father's stillness was the stillness of control of a man who has already decided the outcome of every situation he walks into, and is simply waiting for the world to confirm what he already knows. This man's stillness was the stillness of patience, of someone waiting to hear what you have to say before he decides anything. He said, "Morning," Charlotte said. "Good morning. I apologize for arriving like this. I need—" She stopped. She had spent 3 years preparing what she would say when she got here, and now that she was here, none of the words were the right ones. She said, "I need help." He waited. Charlotte dismounted from Agnes. Her legs were unsteady. When she hit the ground, she had been riding for hours, and her muscles had decided that now that she had stopped, they were allowed to notify her of their condition. She kept her grip on the reins and steadied herself. She said, "My name is Charlotte Whitmore. My father is Richard Whitmore of Whitmore Ranch in Montana. Last night he—" She stopped again, started again. "Last night my father signed a marriage contract with a man named Victor Blackwood. He signed it on my behalf without my consent, because our family has debts, and he sold my future to pay for them. I refused to sign the contract. He told me if I left, I would have nothing. So I left, and I have nothing, and I need—" She stopped. She realized her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her sides and said more quietly, "I need work. I am educated. I can manage accounts and keep records, and I learn quickly, and I will work for wages. I don't need much. I just need—" "I know who your father is," the man said. Charlotte blinked. He said, Heard the Whitmore name a few times. Not always under good circumstances. He pulled off one of his gloves and held out his hand. Jack Sullivan. She shook it. He said, "How long were you riding?" She said, "Since about midnight." He looked at her for a moment, then looked at Agnes, assessing something she couldn't read. He said, "Let's get your horse some water, then you can tell me the rest of it." He brought Agnes to the trough, and Charlotte sat on a fence rail and told him the rest of it. Not the summarized version. The full version. The gambling debts she had pieced together from overheard conversations and the household accounts she had kept in secret. The dinner parties where her father had introduced her to Victor Blackwood's associates with a particular kind of careful attention that she had eventually understood was a sales pitch, the way the marriage contract had materialized on the table. Like something that had been planned for years, because it had been planned for years, and her refusal, and the words her father had used. "You have nothing. You will leave with nothing. You are nothing without this family name, and the ride through the dark." Jack Sullivan listened to all of it, the way he had listened to the beginning of it, without interrupting, without changing expression, in ways that told her what he thought before she was done. He just listened. And when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The contract with Blackwood, it's still valid legally." Charlotte said, "My father signed it. I didn't. But I was told there may be legal complications. My father has lawyers." Jack nodded slowly. He was looking at Agnes, or at something past Agnes, and Charlotte watched him and tried to read the silence, and couldn't. He said, "There's one thing that would make Blackwood's contract unenforceable." Charlotte said, "What?" He looked at her. He said, "If you were already married." The morning was very quiet. Charlotte said, "I don't understand what you're suggesting." Jack said, "I think you do." Charlotte said carefully, "You are a stranger." "Yes. I arrived here less than an hour ago." "Yes? And you are suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," he said. "I'm telling you a legal fact. A marriage contract with one person cannot be enforced against a person who is already legally married to someone else. It's a solution to a specific problem. What you do with that information is your business." Charlotte looked at him. She was trying to find the angle, the place where the offer broke down, where the fine print revealed itself, where the thing that sounded like help turned into a different kind of trap. She said, "What do you want in return?" He said, "Nothing you're not willing to give." She said, "That is not a specific answer." Something almost like a smile crossed his face. "No," he said, "it isn't. But I think you've spent enough of your life with men who gave you very specific answers without asking what you wanted. So I'll ask." He looked at her directly. "What would make this feel like your choice and not another arrangement?" Charlotte was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I control my own money. Whatever wages I earn, I keep them. Whatever accounts I manage them. You don't make decisions about my life without my consent." Jack said, "Agreed. I am not a possession. I know that. And if at any point this," she searched for the word, "arrangement becomes something I need to end, I have the right to end it." He said, "That seems fair." Charlotte looked at him. This stranger. This man who had listened to her for 20 minutes and offered her a solution and agreed to every condition she named without negotiating. She said, "Why?" He said, "Why what? Why would you do this? You don't know me." Jack pulled his glove back on. He looked out over the fence line toward something in the middle distance. He said, "My mother was a woman who was told for 50 years that she didn't have a say in her own life. She died believing it." He was quiet for a second. "I know what you are, and I know what your father is, and those are two different things that should not be confused with each other." Charlotte said nothing. He said, "You don't have to decide right now. I've got a spare room. You can sleep. Your horse can rest. You can have breakfast." He picked up his glove and walked toward the barn. "And then you can decide." Charlotte sat on the fence rail in the Wyoming morning, with mud on her boots and her mother's necklace around her neck, and her hands no longer shaking. She watched him walk away. She thought, "I have been afraid of men my entire life because of what they wanted from me." And then she thought, "This one asked what I wanted." It was the most disorienting moment of the morning. It was more disorienting than the dark, more disorienting than the running, more disorienting somehow than the moment she had pushed the marriage contract back across the table at her father and said, "I am not signing this." She got down from the fence rail. She followed him. The spare room was small and plainly furnished. A bed with a quilt, a washstand, a window that looked out over the east pasture. It was clean and quiet, and nothing like her bedroom in the Whitmore mansion, and Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed with her bag in her lap and found that she could not stop looking at the window. There were no curtains on it. In her room at her father's house, the curtains had always been heavy, thick brocade in a deep burgundy that matched the wallpaper, always drawn at night, always adjusted to a precise angle during the day. Her father had very specific opinions about curtains. This window had no curtains at all, just glass and the morning light coming through it clean and unfiltered, and the land beyond it open, enormous, belonging to no one and to anyone. Charlotte set her bag down on the floor. She lay back on the bed with her coat still on. She was asleep in less than 2 minutes. She woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone working outside, the rhythmic, purposeful sounds of a ranch at mid-morning. She lay still for a moment, disoriented, and then the night came back to her in a sequence of images and feelings that were so vivid and so heavy that she pressed them down deliberately, the way you press on a bruise to understand its edges. She sat up. She went to the washstand and cleaned her face and hands. She straightened her clothes. She ran her fingers through her hair and pulled it back. Then she went to find Jack Sullivan. He was in the kitchen when she came downstairs, and he set a cup of coffee on the table without being asked. She sat down. She said, "I've been thinking about your offer." He said, "I figured. It would have to be completely honest," she said. "I mean that both ways. Not just that I know what the arrangement is and what it isn't, but that the people around us, the town, the workers, whoever they, should not be deceived about our characters, even if the nature of the arrangement is our business." He nodded. She said, "And I want to be useful. Not in a particular way you've decided I should be useful. I want to find where I can be useful and do that work." He said, "What kind of work do you know?" "Accounts, record keeping. I taught myself from my father's books when I was 16. He didn't know. I also—" She paused. "I can read and write Latin, and I read French well enough to follow a conversation. I know more about legal contracts than my father ever intended me to know because he kept them poorly hidden." She looked at him. "I am very good at knowing things I was not supposed to know." Jack Sullivan looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't amusement exactly, and it wasn't surprise, and it wasn't the particular kind of assessment she was used to from men, which always eventually resolved into a calculation of her value by their standards. He said, "I have been losing money for 2 years because my accounts are a mess, and I don't know where the losses are coming from." Charlotte said, "I can find that." He said, "I know you can." She said, "So we have a deal." He said, "We have a deal." And they shook hands across a kitchen table in Wyoming, and outside the window, the morning was ordinary and huge, and Charlotte Whitmore, who had spent her entire life being treated like something that could be owned, made for the first time a choice that belonged entirely to herself. Her father's men would reach the Wyoming border before noon. She didn't know that yet, but she would find out. Richard Whitmore's men arrived at the Sullivan Ranch at 11:47 in the morning. Charlotte knew they were coming before she heard them because Agnes knew first. The mare was in the paddock near the east fence, and she lifted her head and went still in the particular way horses go still when something on the wind doesn't belong. And Charlotte, who had been watching her through the kitchen window while she worked through the second ledger book, set her pen down. She said, "Jack." He was across the room. He looked up from the harness he was mending. He looked at her face. Then he stood up. The sound of horses reached them a few seconds later, more than one, moving at a pace that was not casual. Charlotte stood up from the table. Her hands were steady. She noticed that specifically she looked at them, and they were steady, and she thought, "I am more afraid of my father than I am of strangers, and he is not here yet, so I have until he is." Jack moved to the window without hurrying. He said, 3 horses. 2 men I don't recognize. 1 I do. Charlotte said, who? Dale Pritchard. Works for your father. I've seen him at the cattle auctions. Charlotte closed her eyes for 1 second. Dale Pritchard. She knew the name. He was the man her father sent when he wanted something recovered. Equipment. Livestock. Money owed. He was not a violent man, but he was a thorough one, and her father did not send him unless he wanted something found. She said, they'll say I'm his property. Jack said, let them say it. Jack. Charlotte. He turned from the window and looked at her. Are you going back? She said no. He said, then let's go see what they want. They came out together onto the porch, and the 3 riders pulled up in the yard, and Dale Pritchard took his hat off in a gesture that was technically polite, and actually wasn't, and he said, Miss Whitmore, your father's been worried. Charlotte said, no, he hasn't. Pritchard's expression shifted slightly. He had clearly not expected her to speak first. He said, he sent me to bring you home safely. Charlotte said, I am already home safely. I don't need escorting. One of the 2 men she didn't recognize said something low to the other. Pritchard held up his hand without looking at them. He said, Miss Whitmore, with respect, you left without permission, Charlotte said. That is the word you are looking for. I left without my father's permission, and I would like you to explain to me, Mr. Pritchard, at what age a person stops needing permission to leave a room. Pritchard opened his mouth. Closed it, Jack said from beside her very calmly. She's not going anywhere. She doesn't choose to go. I think you know that's the law. Pritchard looked at Jack for the first time. He took a moment calculating something. Then he looked at Charlotte again and said, Your father has a legal agreement that concerns you, Miss Whitmore. It would be better for everyone if that agreement, Charlotte said, requires my signature, which it does not have, which means it is not an agreement that concerns me in any legal sense. And if your employer has questions about that, his lawyers know where to find a judge. The yard was very quiet. Pritchard looked at her for a long moment. He was reassessing something. She could see it in his face, the specific recalibration of a man who had come expecting a frightened girl and found something else entirely. He said, You've thought about this. She said, I've thought about very little else for 3 years. He put his hat back on. He looked at Jack. He said, Sullivan. Jack said, Pritchard. Pritchard said, This isn't finished. Jack said, I know it isn't. Come back when you have something legal to say. Pritchard turned his horse. The 2 men with him followed. Charlotte watched them ride back down the road until they were out of the yard, and then she turned and went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat on the ledger book in front of her and breathed. Jack came inside and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. He sat down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, You did good. She said, I am shaking. He said, I know. You did it anyway. That's what good looks like. Charlotte picked up the coffee cup. Her hands were shaking now. They hadn't been on the porch, but they were now, the way the fear always comes in after when the thing is over, and your body finally decides it's safe to register it. She held the cup with both hands and let the warmth ground her. She said, They'll go back to my father. He'll tell Victor Blackwood I refuse to come. Jack said, Probably. She said, Blackwood won't accept that. Jack said, No, he won't. She said, So what do we do? Jack was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. Once, twice a gesture she was beginning to recognize as the thing he did when he was thinking through something he didn't want to say wrong. He said, We could go to the county courthouse, today. Get married before Blackwood can file any kind of legal challenge to the arrangement your father made with him. Charlotte set her cup down. She said, We shook hands this morning. He said, I know. She said, You said I could decide. He said, You can. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you the timeline because you asked what we do, and the timeline is relevant. Your father is going to move fast. Blackwood has money and lawyers, and your father owes him a debt, which means your father has no reason to be on your side in this. If we're going to do this, we should do it before they have time to file papers. Charlotte looked at him. She said, You're sure you want to do this? He said, I offered, didn't I? She said, "People offer things they don't mean." He said, "I don't." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had known for less than one full day, who had listened to her talk for 20 minutes and offered her a solution, who had agreed to every condition she named, who had stood beside her on the porch when Pritchard rode in and said she's not going anywhere, she doesn't choose to go, in the same voice he would have used to state the weather. She said, "I need to know something first." He waited. She said, "Why did you say yes this morning? The real reason. Not the one about your mother, although I believe that, and I think it was honest. But you could have said no. You could have let me stay a few days and helped me find another solution. You didn't have to offer this, so why did you?" Jack was quiet. Not the quiet of a man deciding what to say. The quiet of a man who knows exactly what to say and is deciding how honest to be about it. He said, "Because I've been running this ranch alone for 4 years, and I'm losing it, and I didn't know why until you sat down with those ledger books this morning and spent 2 hours in them and found 3 things in the first quarter that I missed in 4 years of looking." He paused. "And because I looked at you on that horse in my yard, and I thought, here is a person who knows how to survive. And I needed someone who knows how to survive." Charlotte said, "So I'm useful to you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That's honest." He said, "You asked for honest." She said, "I did." She picked up her coffee cup again, held it, set it down. "All right, let's go to the courthouse." The magistrate in the county seat was a man named Horace Bly, who was 70 years old and had been marrying people in that county for 31 of those years, and had developed over that time a particular ability to read the nature of a marriage by watching the two people in front of him for approximately 90 seconds. He watched Charlotte and Jack for longer than 90 seconds. He said, "You understand this is a legal and binding contract?" Charlotte said, "Yes." He said, "And you're entering into it of your own free will?" Charlotte said, "More freely than most people enter into anything." He looked at her over his glasses. Then he looked at Jack. He said, "Son." Jack said, "Sir." Bly said, "Is there something going on here I should know about?" Jack said, "There's a man in Montana trying to legally force this woman into a marriage she refused. If we're married, his agreement becomes unenforceable." Bly was quiet for a moment. He set his pen down. He looked at Charlotte. He said, "And this is what you want?" Charlotte said, "This is what I chose." Bly picked his pen back up. He said, "Difference between what you want and what you choose is the whole of human experience, young lady. I've been marrying people long enough to know that." He looked at them both over his glasses one more time. "But I've also been doing this long enough to know that the ones who come in here knowing the difference usually do better than the ones who don't." He opened the registry. He said, "Let's proceed." They were married at 2:17 in the afternoon. Charlotte signed her name in the Charlotte Eleanor, Whitmore, Sullivan, and the pen. Felt strange in her hand, not because she wasn't used to signing her name, but because she was used to signing her name on documents other people had prepared and placed in front of her. This was the first document with her name on it that she had chosen to sign. She looked at the words for a moment after. Charlotte Eleanor Whitmore Sullivan. She was still herself. All 4 of those words were still her. Nothing about signing them had taken anything away. Jack signed beside her. Horace Bly witnessed it. And they walked out into the Wyoming afternoon as 2 strangers who were by every legal definition married to each other. Jack stopped outside the door. He said, "You all right?" Charlotte said, "I'm fine. She stopped. "I don't know what I am. I've never done anything like this before." He said, "Neither have I." She looked at him. "You've been married before?" "No," he said. "I've never been married. I've also never met someone decided in 3 hours and gone to the courthouse." Charlotte said, "It was closer to 4 hours." Something that was almost a laugh moved through his face. He said, "I stand corrected." They stood outside Horace Bly's office for a moment in the afternoon light. Charlotte said, "What do we do now?" He said, "We go back to the ranch. You find where my money is going. I finish the harness. We have supper. And tomorrow we figure out the next thing." She said, "Simple as that." He said, "Simple as that." She said, "Nothing about this is simple." He said, "No. But sometimes you manage things better if you pretend they are until you get your footing." Charlotte nodded. That was, she thought, the most practical piece of advice anyone had given her in 22 years, and it had come from a cowboy she had met at 7 in the morning outside a stable in Wyoming. She said, "All right, let's go back." She found the first real problem in the accounts on the third day. She had been working through the Sullivan Ranch. Ledgers methodically, not frantically, not the way someone searches when they're afraid of what they'll find, but carefully, the way you read something you know is telling you a story you haven't understood yet. She had started with the oldest book Jack had, which went back to when his father had owned the ranch, and she worked forward. The numbers were not catastrophically wrong. That was the first thing she noted. There was no single moment of disaster, no one year in which everything collapsed. The losses were gradual, consistent, small enough in any given month to seem like the normal variance of running a ranch. But when you laid them out across 4 years, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was taking money from the Sullivan Ranch. Not a lot at once. Enough regularly to add up to something devastating. She sat with that for 20 minutes before she said anything. She went back through the numbers twice to be certain. Then she went to find Jack. He was in the barn. She said, "I need to show you something." He looked at her face and set down what he was doing. She said, "You have a problem that isn't accounting errors." He said, "What is it?" She said, "Someone has been taking from you, consistently since about 18 months after your father died. Small amounts. Feed costs, supply orders, livestock records. There are numbers here that don't match the physical records I can see from your purchase receipts. The difference between what you paid and what was actually delivered has been pocketed by someone." Jack was very still. He said, "How much?" Charlotte said, "Over 4 years, roughly $4,000. The sound Jack made was not quite a word. Charlotte said, "I know." He said, "Who?" She said, "I don't know yet, but it's someone who had access to the ordering process. Someone you trusted with the supply accounts." Jack stood in the barn, not moving, and Charlotte watched him absorb something that was not just financial, it was personal. The specific grief of betrayal by someone you trusted, which hits differently than any other kind of loss. She had seen it in her father's face once years ago, when he discovered one of his ranch hands had been stealing from him, though in her father's case the response had been cold and swift and entirely without empathy. Jack's response was different. He said quietly, "I had 3 men who touched those accounts. 2 of them have been with me since before my father died. 1 came on 2 years ago." Charlotte said, "When did the discrepancies start?" He looked at her. The timeline registered in his face before he said it. He said, "Tom Carey came on in the spring, 2 years ago." Charlotte said, "The discrepancies start the following summer." The barn was very quiet. Jack said, "Tom is 24 years old. He has a wife and a baby daughter." Charlotte said, "I know that doesn't make it easier." He said, "No, it doesn't." He was quiet again for a moment. "Is there a way to be sure before I do anything?" Charlotte said. "Give me 1 more day with the records. I can build you something so clear that even his lawyer couldn't argue it." Jack looked at her. He said, "You've done this kind of thing before." Charlotte said, "I've never had a reason to do it professionally, but I understand numbers, and I understand when something is hiding inside them." She paused. "My father kept his debts the same way. Small amounts in different places. I found them when I was 18. I never told him I had." Jack said, "Why not?" Charlotte said, "Because I needed to understand how deep it went before I decided what to do with the information." She met his eyes. "I spent 4 years understanding how deep my father's debts went before last night." Something moved across Jack's face. He said, "You've been planning to leave for 4 years." She said, "I've been planning to survive for 4 years. The leaving was just the first step." She gave him the full accounting the next afternoon. 6 pages of records cross-referenced and annotated showing every discrepancy between what the Sullivan Ranch had paid for and what had been received going back 22 months. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was mathematical, precise, and irrefutable. Jack read it without speaking. Then he said, "I need to talk to him." Charlotte said, "Do you want me there?" He said, "No, this one's mine." She said, "Jack." He looked up. She said, "Be fair to yourself. You trusted him. That's not a weakness. That's what decent people do." He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she couldn't fully name. He said, "My father used to say that the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are honest with him. It's what he does when they aren't." Charlotte said, "Your father sounds like he was worth listening to." Jack said, "He was." He folded the accounting papers and stood up. "I'll be back before supper." He was. And he came back alone, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he looked at his hands, and Charlotte put a cup of coffee in front of him without asking. He said, "Tom confessed. Took about 5 minutes." Charlotte said, "What happens now?" Jack said, "He's going to pay back what he can. Work it off. I won't have him arrested. His daughter is 8 months old." He picked up the coffee. "But he's done working here." Charlotte nodded. Jack said, "You saved this ranch. You know that." She said, "I found the problem. You decide what to do with it. That's different." He said, "Not by as much as you think." She said, "By enough." He looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman who had arrived on his property less than 5 days ago with one bag and a stolen horse and a father who had tried to sell her future, and he said very quietly, "Charlotte." She said, "Don't." He said, "Don't what?" She said, "Don't be grateful to me like I've done something exceptional. I did what I know how to do. That's all anyone can offer." He said, "Most people don't offer it." She said, "Most people haven't spent 22 years having to hide everything they're capable of from the person who was supposed to protect them." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the evening sounds of the ranch horses settling the last birds. The wind that came up every evening from the east moved through the air. Jack said, "Is that what it was like?" Charlotte said, "My father never once asked me what I could do. He only ever thought about what I could be worth." Jack said, "And now?" She looked at the ledger book spread across the table, at the neat columns of her own handwriting, at the work she had done in 5 days that had taken 4 years off the debt load of a ranch that was not yet hers, might never fully be hers, but had given her something she hadn't had since she was a child and didn't know she'd lost. A place where what she could do was wanted. She said, "Now I'm figuring out what I'm worth to myself." The letter arrived from her father on the 6th day. Not through Pritchard this time. Through a lawyer. It came with the Morning Post addressed to Charlotte Whitmore, not Charlotte Sullivan, which told her the lawyer either didn't know about the courthouse visit or was making a point by ignoring it, and it was 3 pages of careful formal language that reduced to one threat. Her father was filing a legal petition to declare the marriage invalid on the grounds that it had been entered into under duress and coercion. Charlotte read the letter twice. Then she looked up and said, "He's claiming I was coerced." Jack read it. He set it down. He said, "He's claiming I coerced you." Charlotte said, "He cannot actually believe that." Jack said, "It doesn't matter what he believes. It matters what he can argue in court." Charlotte said, "He has no evidence." Jack said, "He has lawyers, and he has a financial interest in convincing a judge that you made an uninformed decision under emotional distress after running away from home." Charlotte put the letter down on the table. She said, "This is not going to go away, is it?" Jack said, "No." She said, "He's going to come here." Jack said, "Yes." She said, "With Blackwood." Jack said, "Probably." Charlotte stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there, not looking at anything in particular, just standing while she thought through what this meant and what it required and what she was willing to do. She had known this was coming. She had known it since the first morning, since the moment Pritchard rode into the yard, and she understood that her father was not a man who accepted loss, especially not a loss he had not chosen. She turned around. She said, "Then we need to be ready. Not just legally ready. We need people who can speak to who I am here, what I've done, what I've chosen. If my father wants to stand in front of a judge and call me a woman who can't make her own decisions, I want every person in this county who has watched me make decisions to be able to stand up and say he's wrong." Jack looked at her. He said, "You're thinking about this like a campaign." She said, "I'm thinking about this like a survival, which is what it is." She came back to the table and picked up the letter. "He spent 22 years telling me I was helpless. I intend to make absolutely certain the record disagrees." Jack said, "What do you need?" Charlotte said, "I need to start doing things in town. Things people will see and remember. I need to introduce myself not as a runaway from Montana, but as a person who is here, who is contributing, who is a member of this community. Because when my father stands up and says I was manipulated, I want the judge to have to look at a woman with a name in this county that his client didn't give her." Jack was quiet for a moment. He said, "There's a woman named Dora Hutchins in town who runs the schoolroom. She's been looking for someone to help with the older children on arithmetic. She mentioned it to me last month." Charlotte said, "I'll go see her tomorrow." Jack said, "And the bank in town, Frank Aldrich, he's been wanting someone to help organize a community lending record. Keep track of small loans between ranchers. Informal but consistent." Charlotte said, "I'll see him the day after." Jack said, "You'll be busy." Charlotte said, "Good, I work better busy." She picked up her pen and started a list. Jack watched her for a moment, and in his face was something she still didn't fully have a name for. Something that had been there since the third day, when she set the first corrected page of his ledger down in front of him, and he had looked at it the way you look at something you'd given up expecting to find. He said, "Charlotte." She looked up. He said, "He's going to come here angry." She said, "I know." He said, "And Blackwood is going to come here with money and lawyers and the assumption that he can buy whatever decision he needs." She said, "I know that too." He said, "And you're not afraid." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the truth of that question, whether she was afraid. She was. She was genuinely afraid in a way that sat low in her chest and did not go away. The specific fear of a person who knows exactly what they are risking and knows exactly what they stand to lose and has chosen to stand in the road anyway. She said, "I am afraid every single day. I was afraid every day in my father's house too. The difference is that here the fear is mine. I chose it. He can't use it against me if I chose it." Jack said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, like he was saying something he had not said out loud before, "I think you might be the most determined person I've ever met." Charlotte said, "I'm just someone who spent too long not being allowed to be." She looked back down at her list. She wrote Dora Hutchins, Frank Aldrich, town meeting schedule, county records, what's public, what's accessible. Horace Bly, what documentation does he keep of marriages? She wrote, "Do not let them define this story. Write it first." Outside, the evening was coming down over the Sullivan Ranch, and the horses were moving in the paddock, and the wind was from the east. And somewhere between Montana and Wyoming, a man named Richard Whitmore was making plans. And his daughter was making better ones. Dora Hutchins was a small woman with sharp eyes, and the particular kind of directness that belongs to people who have spent years trying to hold the attention of children who would rather be anywhere else. She was 43 years old, had been running the schoolroom in Clearwater since she was 26, and she had developed over those 17 years a finely calibrated ability to assess a person's character in approximately the time it took them to walk through a door. Charlotte walked through her door on a Tuesday morning, and Dora assessed her in about 4 seconds, and then she said, "You're the Whitmore girl who married Jack Sullivan last week." Charlotte said, "I'm Charlotte Sullivan, yes." Dora said, "Sit down. Do you want coffee?" Charlotte said, "Please." Dora poured 2 cups, sat down across from her, and said, "Jack told me you were coming. He said you were good with numbers and could teach." She looked at Charlotte steadily. "He also said your father is Richard Whitmore of Montana, and that there's some kind of legal trouble coming." Charlotte said, "Jack talks to you regularly." Dora said, "Jack Sullivan has been bringing supplies to this schoolroom every winter since his father died. He is one of 4 people in this county I would trust with my life, and one of 2 I would trust with my students." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "So yes, he talks to me. And I'm talking to you now, which is its own kind of answer." Charlotte felt something unknot slightly in her chest. She said, "What did he tell you about the legal trouble?" Dora said, "That your father made a deal that wasn't his to make, and that he's not the kind of man who accepts being told no." She paused. That description fit about half the men I've met in my life, so I didn't find it especially surprising. Charlotte said, "He's going to try to have my marriage declared invalid." Dora said, "On what grounds?" Charlotte said, "Coercion. He'll argue I was emotionally compromised after leaving home and that Jack took advantage of the situation." Dora was quiet for a moment. She looked at Charlotte with those sharp eyes. She said, "Were you?" Charlotte met her gaze. "Emotionally compromised, yes. Taken advantage of, no. There is a significant difference." Dora said, "Good. You know the difference. That matters." She set her cup down. "When can you start with the children?" Charlotte said. "Tomorrow if you need me." Dora said, "I need you today. I have 8 children between the ages of 10 and 14 who are supposed to be learning long division and have instead been learning increasingly creative ways to convince me they already know it." She stood up. "Finish your coffee." Charlotte finished her coffee. She taught arithmetic for 3 hours that morning, and at the end of it, a 12-year-old boy named Henry Marsh, who had spent the first hour looking at her with the particular skepticism children reserve for adults. They have decided not to cooperate with, worked through a problem on the board without help, and turned around with an expression of such genuine surprise at his own success that Charlotte had to look at the window for a moment. She had never taught anyone anything before. She had only ever been managed, redirected, corrected. This was entirely different. This felt like building something. She came back to the ranch that afternoon and told Jack about Henry Marsh, and Jack listened to all of it, and when she was done he said, "You'll go back tomorrow." She said, "Every day Dora will have me." He said, "Good." She said, "It's also good for us in terms of the legal situation." He said, "Charlotte." She stopped. He said, "I know it's good for the legal situation. I also meant it's good for you." He paused. "You look different than you did this morning." She said, "Different how?" He said, "Less like someone running, more like someone arriving." Charlotte said nothing for a moment. She looked at her hands. She thought about Henry Marsh's face when the numbers came out right. She said, "Is that what it looks like?" He said, "From where I'm standing." She met Frank Aldrich at the bank 2 days later, and he was nothing like what she had expected, which was a man who would need to be persuaded to take her seriously. Frank Aldrich was 60 years old and had been a banker in Clearwater since before half its residents were born, and he had developed over those decades a simple philosophy. He trusted competence where he found it regardless of where it came from. Because in his experience, incompetence was expensive and he couldn't afford it. He looked at the sample record. Charlotte had prepared a clean cross-referenced system for tracking informal lending between ranchers with a ledger format that could be replicated and maintained by anyone who could read and add. And he said, "Where did you learn to set up a system like this?" Charlotte said, "My father's accounts. I kept them in secret from the time I was 16. Aldrich said, "In secret." She said, "He didn't know I understood numbers. He thought I was organizing his social correspondence." Aldrich looked at the system again. He said, "Did he know you were reading his contracts too?" Charlotte said, "No." He said, "What did you do with what you found in them?" She said, "Survived." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. He said, "I'm going to offer you a formal arrangement. Part-time for now. I want this lending record built properly, and I want someone to maintain it who isn't going to make it worse than no record at all." He paused. "I pay fair wages." Charlotte said, "I want it in writing." He said, "Of course." She said, "And I want it in my name, Charlotte Sullivan, not my husband's." Aldrich's eyebrows rose slightly. He said, "That's unusual." She said, "I know." He said, "Is Sullivan all right with that?" Charlotte said, "I didn't ask him." Aldrich looked at her again with the expression of a man filing something away for future reference. Then he said, "I'll have the paperwork drawn up by Friday." Charlotte said, "Thank you." She walked out of Frank Aldrich's bank with a job that was hers, in her name, paying wages that were hers on the strength of work she had done in secret for 6 years, while her father thought she was sorting his mail. She stood outside in the Clearwater afternoon and thought my father spent 22 years telling me I was worth a marriage contract. I just walked out of a bank with a salary. She walked back to the ranch, and she did not tell Jack about the salary immediately. She sat with it for an evening, held it the way you hold something you're not yet sure is real, and then at supper she said, "Frank Aldrich offered me a formal position." Jack said, "I figured he would." She said, "I told him I wanted it in my name, Charlotte Sullivan, not yours." Jack said, "Seems right." She said, "You're not bothered by that." He said, "Why would I be bothered by that?" She said, "Most men would be." He said, "I'm not most men." She looked at him. She said, "No, you're not." She paused. "I'm still getting used to that." He said, "Take your time." The town of Clearwater was the kind of place that formed opinions slowly and held them firmly, and over the following 3 weeks, Charlotte moved through it with a precision she had learned from her father, because the one useful thing Richard Whitmore had taught her entirely by example was how to build a reputation through consistent visible action. Her father had done it in service of his own pride. Charlotte did it in service of her survival. She taught at Dora's schoolroom 4 mornings a week. She kept Frank Aldrich's lending records 2 afternoons a week. She attended the community meeting that was held every second Saturday in the back room of the general store, and she sat and listened the first time and the second time, and on the third time, when a question came up about a disputed property line that had been creating conflict between 2 neighboring ranchers for years, she said quietly, "I looked at the county records on that parcel last week. The original survey was wrong. Both men are working from a faulty line." And she laid out what she had found, and the room was quiet, and then it wasn't, and by the time the meeting ended, both ranchers had agreed to a new survey, and were not speaking to each other with the particular charged silence of men who had just been saved from a fight they had both been looking forward to having. Dora Hutchins, walking out beside her, said, "You just did in 20 minutes what those 2 men have been refusing to do for 3 years. Charlotte said, "I looked at the papers." Dora said, "Everyone could have looked at the papers." Charlotte said, "No one looked at the papers." Dora said, "That's my point." 3 weeks after Charlotte arrived in Clearwater, she was no longer the woman who had married Jack Sullivan under strange circumstances and arrived from Montana with mud on her boots. She was the woman who had fixed Henry Marsh's arithmetic and straightened out Frank Aldrich's lending records and resolved a property dispute that had been a standing argument at community meetings for 18 months. She was becoming someone with a name in Clearwater. And then her father arrived. Joel. She knew it before she saw him. She knew it the way she had always known when Richard Whitmore was coming, a shift in the atmosphere around her, the particular way her body registered threat before her mind caught up. She was at the schoolroom on a Thursday morning when she felt it, and she stopped in the middle of explaining a long division problem to Henry Marsh and stood very still for 3 seconds. Henry said, "Mrs. Sullivan." She said, "Sorry, keep going with that problem. I'll be right back." She stepped outside. Her father's carriage was at the end of the road. She recognized it immediately. The dark wood, the brass fixtures, the way it moved, because Richard Whitmore moved through the world in ways that were designed to announce themselves. Behind the carriage were 2 horses, and on those horses were 2 men. And beside the carriage rode Victor Blackwood on a gray horse that was considerably better than any horse he deserved. Charlotte looked at them coming down the road toward her. She felt the fear arrive clear old, and she breathed through it. Then she went back inside and said to Dora, "My father is here. I need to go." Dora looked at her. She said, "Do you need someone with you?" Charlotte said, "Not yet." She looked at the children. Henry Marsh was watching her with the specific alertness of a 12-year-old who understands more than adults think he does. She said, "Henry, you're in charge of that problem until Mrs. Hutchins takes over. I want to see your work when I come back." Henry said, "Yes, ma'am." She walked out into the morning. They met in the road in front of the schoolroom, which was not where Charlotte would have chosen, but she did not try to move the confrontation somewhere more private. Private was where her father operated best. He was a man who had spent his life making his decisions in rooms where no one else could see them. She wanted witnesses. Richard Whitmore stepped down from the carriage. How was the same as he always was. The straight back, the still hands, the eyes that moved only when he chose. He was wearing a good coat and his best boots, which told her he had dressed for this carefully, which told her he understood this was a performance. Victor Blackwood stayed on his horse. He was a heavy man with a face that was not unhandsome, but was deeply accustomed to getting what it wanted. And he looked at Charlotte the way he had looked at her, the one time they had met in her father's dining room, with the flat assessment of a man pricing something he has already decided to buy. Charlotte looked at her father. She said, "Father." He said, "Charlotte." He looked at her steadily. "You look well." She said, "I am well." He said, "We need to talk." She said, "We are talking." His eyes moved briefly to the left to the general store, where two men had stopped on the porch to watch, and to the end of the road, where a woman with a basket had paused. His jaw tightened slightly. He said, "In private." Charlotte said, "No." The word landed between them simply. He said, "Charlotte." She said, "You are welcome to say whatever you came to say right here. This is my town, father. These are my neighbors. If you have something to tell me, you can tell me in front of them." Victor Blackwood shifted on his horse. "My name is Mrs. Sullivan. I would appreciate you using it." A muscle in Blackwood's jaw moved. Richard Whitmore said quietly, "The marriage is not valid. You know that." Charlotte said, "The county magistrate disagrees with you." He said, "The county magistrate made a decision based on incomplete information. You entered into that marriage under emotional duress, having fled your home in the middle of the night without." "I entered into that marriage," Charlotte said, "with full knowledge of what I was doing, why I was doing it, and what it meant. I am 22 years old. I am not incompetent. I am not confused. I am not in need of protection from a decision I made in the full possession of my own mind." Her voice was steady. It was the steadiest it had ever been. "If you want to argue otherwise in front of a judge, you are welcome to try." Her father looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You have made a serious mistake." She said, "You made the mistake, father. You made it when you put my name on a contract without asking me. Everything I have done since then has been a correction." The road was very quiet. From the porch of the general store, one of the men, she would later learn his name was Bill Garrett, who had ranched in the county for 30 years, and who was not a man given to public expressions of opinion, said not loudly, but clearly enough, "Sounds right to me." Richard Whitmore's eyes moved to the porch, then back to Charlotte. Something happened in his face in that moment. Something she had never seen before and would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It was not anger exactly. It was something more like the specific disorientation of a man who has walked into a room expecting to find it arranged the way he arranged it, and found instead that someone else has been in here and changed everything. He said, "This is not finished." Charlotte said, "I know." He said, "We have filed a petition with the district court. A judge will hear this case within the month." She said, "I will be there." He said, "You should come home, Charlotte, before this gets worse." And Charlotte said with a quiet and absolute finality that surprised even herself, "I am home." Her father looked at her. He looked at the road she was standing in the middle of. He looked at the schoolroom behind her. He looked at the men on the porch and the woman with the basket and the whole ordinary, unglamorous, deeply rooted texture of a life that his daughter had built in 3 weeks in a county he had never been to. And he got back into his carriage. She was shaking by the time she got back inside the schoolroom. Not visibly. She had learned a long time ago not to shake visibly. But inside, in the place beneath the steadiness. She was shaking from her chest outward, and she stood in the doorway for a moment with her hand on the frame and breathed. Dora appeared at her shoulder. She said quietly, "You all right?" Charlotte said, "I will be." Dora said, "He's leaving." Charlotte said, "He's going to court." Dora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Bill Garrett just came in. He said to tell you he'll speak to the judge if it comes to that." Charlotte turned to look at her. Dora said, He said he's heard enough from enough men like your father in his life, and he would like an opportunity to be on the right side of something for once. She paused. His words, not mine. He's not as poetic as he thinks he is. Charlotte said, he'd really testify. Dora said, he and 3 others who were on that porch. Yes. She looked at Charlotte steadily. People have been watching you for 3 weeks, Charlotte. You've been building something here every day. You didn't see it because you were too busy doing it. But we saw it. Charlotte pressed her hand harder against the doorframe. She said, I didn't do it to be watched. Dora said, I know. That's why it worked. The court date was set for the 17th of November. Charlotte spent the weeks between the confrontation in the road and that date doing 2 things simultaneously, and the skill required to do both at once was something she would later recognize as the first proof that she was more capable than even she had understood. The first thing she did was continue building her life in Clearwater. Every morning she was at the schoolroom. Every afternoon she was at the bank or at the ranch or at the community meetings or in conversation with the people of the county who were slowly and without drama becoming people she knew. Henry Marsh's arithmetic improved so dramatically that his mother came to the schoolroom one afternoon specifically to find Charlotte and say, I don't know what you did, but he did sums at supper last night of his own choice, which I would not have believed possible. Frank Aldrich's lending records became so well organized that 2 neighboring counties asked whether the system could be replicated in their banks. The property dispute Charlotte had resolved at the community meeting inspired 3 other ranchers to bring their own disputed records to her, and she worked through all of them. She became, in the language of Clearwater, Wyoming, a useful person. The second thing she did was prepare for court. She did this with the same methodical precision she had applied to Jack's accounts and Frank Aldrich's lending system. She pulled the county legal records and read every relevant precedent she could find. She wrote to a lawyer in Cheyenne, a woman, one of the first female lawyers in Wyoming, whose name Frank Aldrich gave her, and described the situation in full detail, and received back a letter of 12 pages that was the most useful document she had read in years. The lawyer's name was Margaret Voss, and her letter said in part that Charlotte's case was strong on 2 grounds. First, that she had entered the marriage freely and demonstrably. And second, that the original contract between Richard Whitmore and Victor Blackwood had been entered into without Charlotte's knowledge or consent, making it a contract with a third party about a person who was not property and had not agreed to be treated as such. Charlotte read the letter 4 times. She wrote back. She and Margaret Voss exchanged 6 letters in 3 weeks, and by the end of the 6th letter, they had assembled between them a legal argument that Charlotte was quietly confident was very nearly airtight. Jack read the correspondence on the night before the court date. He set it down. He said, "You built this yourself." She said, "With Margaret Voss's help." He said, "You found Margaret Voss." Charlotte said, "Frank Aldrich found her." Jack said, "Charlotte." She said, "I know. I'm not being modest. I built this. I'm just not sure I'm used to saying that yet." He said, "Start getting used to it." She looked at the correspondence spread across the table. At 6 letters, 3 weeks of work, an argument assembled from county records and legal precedent, and the particular knowledge of contracts she had taught herself at 16 by reading documents her father didn't know she could understand. She said, "Jack, whatever happens tomorrow." He said, "Don't." She said, "I need to say it." He said, "Charlotte." She said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you should know that this what you gave me here was not what I expected. I came to your ranch with a bag and a horse and a plan to survive. I didn't expect—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't expect to find something worth fighting to keep." The kitchen was very quiet. Jack said, "Is that what this feels like? Something worth fighting for?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He picked up his coffee cup. "Because I intend to be there when the fighting's done." She said, "You understand this is my fight." He said, "I know." She said, "You can be there, but it's mine." He said, "I wouldn't have it any other way." The night before the court date, Charlotte could not sleep. She lay in the room that had been a spare room and was now hers. She had gradually, and without announcement, made it hers. Added her books to the shelf, hung her mother's second necklace on the mirror, rearranged the washstand in a way that suited her, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about her father. Not about the court case. She had thought enough about the court case. She thought about her father himself, the man beneath the performance if there was one. She had spent 22 years trying to understand whether there was a Richard Whitmore beneath the Richard Whitmore. She knew some original version of a man who had looked at his daughter and felt something uncomplicated before the debts and the pride and the relentless management of everything in his possession had calcified into the person who had slid a marriage contract across a table and said, "You should be grateful." She didn't reach any conclusions. She wasn't sure there were conclusions to reach. She got up at 5 in the morning and went to the kitchen and made coffee, and Jack was already there, which surprised her, and he said, "Couldn't sleep either." She said, "No." He poured her coffee. She said, "Are you worried?" He said, "About the case, no. You built something solid." She said, "Then what?" I was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm thinking about what it costs you, even if we win. Standing in front of a judge and making the argument that your own father treated you like property. That doesn't go away after the verdict." Charlotte looked at him. She said, "No, it doesn't." He said, "I know." She said, "I think the worst part is that it's true. And he knows it's true. And he will stand in that courtroom and argue something he knows is false, and he will feel entirely justified in doing it, because in his mind what he was trying to do for me with Victor Blackwood was reasonable. He will never understand that he was wrong." Jack said, "Will that bother you if he never understands?" Charlotte thought about it honestly. She said, "It used to terrify me, the idea that he would never see it. I used to think I needed him to understand in order for it to be real, in order for what I knew about myself to be true." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "But I think I've learned something in the last few weeks. What I know about myself doesn't require his agreement." Jack said, "When did you figure that out?" She said, "When Henry Marsh got a problem right and looked at me like I'd given him something." She paused. "My father never looked at me like that. Not once. And I spent 22 years trying to earn it. I didn't know what I was missing until I found it somewhere else." The kitchen was very quiet. Then Jack said, "Let's win this thing today." Charlotte said, "Yes." She finished her coffee. She put on her best dress, not her finest, because her finest was at her father's house, and she had left it there deliberately, but the one she had bought herself with the first wages she had earned at Frank Aldrich's bank, a deep blue that was nothing like the colors her father had chosen for her. She pinned her mother's necklace at her throat. She looked in the mirror for one moment. The woman looking back at her was not the woman who had stood outside the dining room door 3 weeks ago, pressing her hand flat against the wood and trying to gather the courage to go inside. She went to the courthouse. Her father was already there. Victor Blackwood was already there. 2 lawyers she didn't recognize were already there, and behind. Charlotte filing into the courtroom, one by one, were Dora Hutchins, Frank Aldrich, Bill Garrett, Henry Marsh's mother, the 2 ranchers whose property dispute she had resolved, Horace Bly the magistrate, and 6 other people from Clearwater who had decided without being asked that they had something to say. Charlotte sat down at the respondent's table. She put her hands flat on the surface. She breathed. The judge came in. Richard Whitmore looked across the courtroom at his daughter. Charlotte looked back. She did not look away first. The judge's name was Cornelius Hatch, and he had been sitting on the district bench for 19 years, and in those 19 years he had heard cases involving land fraud, cattle theft, murder, bankruptcy, breach of contract, and every variety of domestic dispute that human beings in the Wyoming Territory were capable of generating. He was not a sentimental man. He was not easily impressed. He had a face that had settled over 2 decades of listening to people lie to him and tell him the truth, and sometimes do both in the same sentence, into an expression of permanent calibrated skepticism. He looked at the courtroom when he sat down. He looked at the petitioner's table where Richard Whitmore sat with 2 lawyers flanking him and Victor Blackwood seated behind, and he looked at the respondent's table where Charlotte Sullivan sat alone. Margaret Voss had not been able to make the journey from Cheyenne in time, and Charlotte had decided the night before that she would represent herself, which was either the bravest or the most reckless decision she had ever made, and she had not yet determined which. And then he looked at the gallery, which was fuller than any civil proceeding in Clearwater had been in recent memory. He said, "This is a petition to invalidate a marriage on grounds of coercion and emotional incapacity. Before we begin, I want to be clear about something." He looked at both tables. "I have read the petition. I have read the respondent's written reply. This court is not interested in family grievances, financial arrangements, or the question of what any party believes they were owed. This court is interested in one question: did Charlotte Sullivan enter into her marriage of her own free will, in full possession of her faculties, understanding the nature and consequences of what she was doing? That is the only question. Is that understood?" Richard Whitmore's lead lawyer said, "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Hatch looked at Charlotte. She said, "Yes, Your Honor." He said, "Then let's proceed." Richard Whitmore's lawyer, a man named Arthur Price, who had been practicing law in Helena for 20 years, and who had the bearing of someone who considered Wyoming a professional inconvenience, stood and began laying out the petition. He was skilled. Charlotte gave him that. He built the argument carefully and without obvious exaggeration, and the version of events he described was not a fabrication exactly, but a particular arrangement of facts that, taken without context, produced a picture of a young woman who had fled her home in emotional distress and been manipulated by a calculated man into a hasty marriage designed to serve his interests. He did not say that Charlotte was stupid. He was too smart for that. He implied she was vulnerable, which was, Charlotte knew, considerably more dangerous in a courtroom. He called Richard Whitmore to testify first. Her father took the stand with the same measured composure he brought to everything, and he described the night Charlotte left in language that was heartbreaking in its precision. The worried father, the daughter who had been under strain, the hasty departure in the dark, the concern for her safety. He described Victor Blackwood as a man who had offered to help the family through a difficult period. He did not use the word contract. He used the phrase an arrangement of mutual support. Charlotte wrote on the paper in front of her mutual support. She underlined it twice. Price said, "And in your assessment, Mr. Whitmore was your daughter in a state to make a sound legal decision within hours of leaving your home in the middle of the night?" Richard Whitmore said, "No, I don't believe she was. Charlotte is a sensitive young woman. She was frightened and confused. I believe she was taken advantage of by someone who saw an opportunity." Charlotte kept her face completely still. She wrote on her paper sensitive, frightened, confused. She wrote my father's vocabulary for a woman who disagreed with him. Price said, "No further questions." Judge Hatch looked at Charlotte. "Mrs. Sullivan, you may cross-examine." Charlotte stood up. She picked up her paper and walked to the front of the room. She looked at her father on the stand. He looked back at her with an expression she recognized, the patient, slightly sorrowful look of a man performing reasonableness for an audience. She said, "Father, you described the arrangement with Mr. Blackwood as one of mutual support. Can you describe what my contribution to that arrangement was supposed to be?" Price said, "Objection, relevance." Judge Hatch said, "Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Whitmore." Her father said, "Charlotte was to be married to Mr. Blackwood." Charlotte said, "And what was Mr. Blackwood's contribution to the arrangement?" Her father said, he agreed to assume certain financial obligations of the Whitmore family." Charlotte said, "So the arrangement was, Mr. Blackwood pays our debts, and in return, I marry him. Is that correct?" A pause. Her father said, "That is a reductive characterization." Charlotte said, "Is it factually accurate?" Another pause. Her father said, "In simple terms, yes." Charlotte said, "When was I informed of this arrangement?" Her father said, "You were informed." Charlotte said, "On what date, father, specifically?" Her father said, "The evening before you left." Charlotte said, "So I was informed of an arrangement that had already been made on my behalf, without my knowledge, on the evening before you expected me to sign a contract formalizing it. Is that correct?" Richard Whitmore's jaw tightened. He said, "You were being taken care of." Charlotte said, "I didn't ask you whether I was being taken care of. I asked whether I was informed of an arrangement made on my behalf without my knowledge, and whether I was given less than 24 hours to accept it." She looked at him steadily. "Yes or no, father?" The courtroom was absolutely silent. Richard Whitmore said, "Yes." Charlotte said, "Thank you. No further questions." She walked back to her table. Her hands were shaking again. She put them in her lap where no one could see them. Judge Hatch said, "The petitioner may call his next witness." Price called Victor Blackwood. Blackwood took the stand with the ease of a man who was comfortable performing authority, and he described himself as a concerned party who had invested significantly in good faith and had been wronged by a breach of agreement. He said the word investment 3 times. He said Miss Whitmore every time, refusing the name Sullivan, and each time he did it, Charlotte wrote it down. When Price finished, Charlotte stood again. She said, "Mr. Blackwood, you've referred to me as Miss Whitmore 3 times in your testimony. Are you aware that I have been legally married under the name Sullivan for 3 weeks?" He said, "I am aware of a ceremony that took place, yes." She said, "A ceremony recognized by the county magistrate of this jurisdiction." He said, "A ceremony I believe to be invalid." She said, "That's what this court is here to determine. In the meantime, would you use my legal name?" He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Irritation, reassessment, the specific displeasure of a man being corrected by someone he has decided not to respect. He said, "Mrs. Sullivan." Charlotte said, "Thank you. Mr. Blackwood, you described your arrangement with my father as an investment made in good faith. Can you tell the court what specifically you invested in?" He said, "I agreed to assume the Whitmore family debts in exchange for." Charlotte said, "In exchange for." He said, "For the proposed marriage." Charlotte said, "So your investment was contingent on the marriage?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And the marriage required my consent?" He said, "The arrangement had been made." Charlotte said, "I understand an arrangement had been made. I'm asking whether the marriage, the legal ceremony, required my consent." He said, "Your father represented." Charlotte said, "Mr. Blackwood." Her voice was quiet and absolutely clear. "Does a legal marriage in this territory require the free consent of both parties?" He said stiffly, "Yes." She said, "Did I give my consent to the arrangement my father made with you?" A long pause. He said, "You refused to sign the contract." Charlotte said, "I refused to sign the contract, so my consent was not given." He said, "Your father." Charlotte said, "My father is not me. He could not give consent on my behalf. I am a 22-year-old woman, not a piece of property that transfers with a signature." She looked at him with the same steadiness she had used in the road when her father arrived. "Which means the arrangement you made with my father was contingent on a consent that was never given and was not your father's to promise. Is that correct?" Blackwood said nothing. Judge Hatch said, "Answer the question, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood said, "The situation is more complex then." Charlotte said, "Yes or no, Mr. Blackwood? Was the arrangement contingent on my consent?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Which I did not give." He said, "You refused without reasonable cause." Charlotte said, "Thank you. No further questions." She sat down. From the gallery behind her, she heard a sound not loud, not disruptive, but unmistakable. The sound of multiple people exhaling at the same moment. Price called 2 more witnesses, a doctor from Helena who had never met Charlotte but was prepared to testify about the psychological fragility of young women under stress, which Judge Hatch cut off within 4 minutes by asking the doctor whether he had ever examined Charlotte personally, and when the doctor said no, the judge said, "Then your testimony is conjecture, not evidence," and dismissed him. Which was the first moment in the proceedings when Charlotte allowed herself to feel something that was adjacent to hope. Then it was her turn. She called Dora Hutchins first. Dora took the stand with the composed authority of a woman who had been managing rooms full of resistant people for 17 years, and she described Charlotte in the same straightforward language she used for everything. She said Charlotte had begun working at the schoolroom within days of arriving in Clearwater. She said the work Charlotte did was skilled, patient, and effective. She said Charlotte had never once in her presence behaved like a woman who was confused or compromised or incapable of making her own decisions. She said when Price attempted to suggest that Charlotte might have been performing competence to build a legal case, "In my experience, you can perform competence for about 45 minutes before children expose you completely." Mrs. Sullivan has been teaching my students for 3 weeks. They respect her. You cannot fake that. Price had no effective follow-up. She called Frank Aldrich, who described the lending system Charlotte had built and the wage arrangement she had insisted on having in her own name. He said without being asked, "A woman who insists on a formal written employment contract in her own name is not a woman who doesn't understand what she's doing." He said it with the quiet finality of a man who has seen enough fraudulent paperwork to know the difference between confusion and clarity. She called Bill Garrett, who said without embellishment that he had watched Charlotte Whitmore Sullivan stand in the road in front of her father and speak with more clarity and self-possession than most people he'd met in 60 years of ranching, and that in his opinion, the only person in that road who hadn't understood the situation was Richard Whitmore himself. She called Horace Bly, who described the marriage ceremony. He described the questions he had asked and the answers Charlotte had given. He said when Price pressed him on whether Charlotte had seemed distressed, "She seemed like a woman who was solving a problem she'd been handed without her consent, using the tools available to her. That's not distress. That's sense." And then Judge Hatch said, "Mrs. Sullivan, do you wish to testify on your own behalf?" Charlotte said, "Yes, Your Honor." She stood at the front of the room and she told the truth. Not the summarized version. Not the careful legal version she had rehearsed with Margaret Voss's letters in front of her. The truth. The dining room. The contract. The words her father had said. The night ride. The fear. The morning at Jack's ranch, and the offer she had evaluated with the same clear-eyed precision she had applied to everything in her life that she had been allowed to evaluate for herself, which was not much, but which she had used as fully as she could. She said, "I was afraid when I arrived at the Sullivan Ranch. I was exhausted. I was cold. My horse was tired. I had ridden through the night in the dark with my father's men behind me." She paused. "All of that is true. And I was thinking with complete clarity the entire time. Fear and clarity are not opposites. If they were, no one who had ever been in danger would have survived it." She looked at Judge Hatch. She said, "Your Honor, the petitioner wants this court to believe that a woman who is afraid cannot think. That a woman who has left a controlling situation is too damaged to make decisions. That a woman who acts quickly in her own defense is acting impulsively rather than decisively." She paused. "I would like you to consider the possibility that a woman who has spent 22 years thinking very carefully about a situation, preparing for it in secret, executing a plan in the dark, and building a life in a new county in 3 weeks is not confused. She is the most clear-headed person in this courtroom." The room was very quiet. Charlotte said, "I am asking this court to recognize that I am a person, not a contract, not an asset, not a debt to be paid or an arrangement to be honored. A person who made a legal choice under legal circumstances and has the right to have that choice respected." She looked at her father. "That is all I have ever asked." She went back to her seat. Judge Hatch deliberated for 40 minutes. Charlotte sat at the table and did not allow herself to move or speak or look at anyone in the gallery. She kept her hands on the table. She kept her breathing even. She thought about her mother's necklace at her throat and what her mother had been, a woman who had not been given the choices Charlotte had fought for, a woman who had lived inside the same house and the same management and the same careful diminishment and had not found a way out before she died. Charlotte thought, "I am doing this for myself, and I am doing it for her." Jack was in the gallery. She could feel him there without looking, the particular quality of his stillness, which she had learned to recognize in the weeks she had lived near him, the way his presence in a room registered as steady rather than loud. He did not try to catch her eye. He did not make gestures of reassurance. He simply sat and was there, which was, she had come to understand, his primary skill and most significant virtue. At the end of 40 minutes, Judge Hatch returned. He sat down. He looked at his papers. He said, "I have considered the petition filed by Richard Whitmore to invalidate the marriage of Charlotte Whitmore Sullivan and Jack Sullivan on grounds of coercion and emotional incapacity." He paused. "I have found no credible evidence of coercion. The testimony of multiple independent witnesses establishes that Mrs. Sullivan has been fully functional, professionally engaged, and demonstrably capable of complex decision-making from the day of her arrival in this county." He paused again. I have also found the petitioner's central argument that a woman under emotional stress cannot make legally valid decisions to be both legally insufficient and frankly insulting to common sense. Charlotte pressed her hands flat on the table. The judge said, "The petition is denied. The marriage of Charlotte Sullivan and Jack Sullivan is legally valid and will stand." He brought his gavel down. The gallery behind Charlotte erupted. Not dramatically, not in the theatrical way of courtrooms and stories, but in the warm, overlapping way of people who have been holding their breath and have just been given permission to breathe. Dora Hutchins said something Charlotte couldn't hear. Bill Garrett made a sound that was approximately a word. Frank Aldrich stood up. Charlotte sat still for one moment longer. She pressed her hands flat against the table. She looked at the grain of the wood. She thought, "I did it. Not we. Not anyone else. She had built this. She had stood in this room and spoken, and the words had held. She thought, I did it." Then she stood up. Her father was across the room. He was speaking to Price in a low, tight voice, and Price was saying something that clearly involved the phrase, "higher court," because that was what lawyers said when they lost, and their clients had money. And Charlotte watched this exchange for exactly 3 seconds, and then turned away from it. She was done watching her father's face for information about her own worth. She turned toward the gallery. Jack was standing. He looked at her. His expression was the one she had come to trust most. Not congratulatory, not effusive, not the performance of a feeling, but simply present, simply there, seeing her. She walked toward him, and Victor Blackwood's voice came from behind her. He said, "Mrs. Sullivan." She stopped. She turned. Blackwood had come around the table. He was not with his lawyer. He was alone, and he was standing in the aisle, and he looked at her with an expression she had not expected, not anger, not the flat assessment she was used to from him, but something more complicated, something that might have been in another man closer to shame. He said, "I want you to know." He stopped, reconsidered, started again. "Your father told me you would come around, that you were being dramatic, that once you understood the situation, you would see reason." He looked at her steadily. "I believed him." Charlotte said, "I know." He said, "I shouldn't have." The words sat between them for a moment. Charlotte said, "No, you shouldn't have." He said, "I misjudged you." She said, "You didn't judge me at all. You looked at a woman and saw an arrangement. That's not a judgment. That's a failure to look." Blackwood was quiet for a moment. He said, "What your father owes me the debts," Charlotte said. "That is between you and my father. It has nothing to do with me. It never did." He nodded slowly. He said, "Good luck to you, Mrs. Sullivan." She said, "I don't need luck, Mr. Blackwood. I have a plan." She turned and walked the rest of the way to where Jack was standing. He said very quietly, "You did it." She said, "We have a lot of work to do back at the ranch. I found 2 more discrepancies in the winter supply accounts this morning before we left." He stared at her. She said, "What?" He said, "You found accounting errors this morning, before a court case." She said, "The numbers don't stop being wrong because I have somewhere else to be." He made a sound that was fully a laugh. This time surprised out of him, genuine, the kind of laugh that has no performance in it. He said, "No, I suppose they don't." She said, "Can we go home?" He said, "Yes," and they walked out of the Clearwater courthouse together. And in the doorway, Charlotte paused for one moment and looked back at the room at the table where she had sat at the judge's bench at the gallery, where Dora and Frank and Bill Garrett were gathering their coats at the far table, where her father still stood speaking to his lawyer, not looking at her. Then she looked at the door. She walked through it. Her father came to the ranch one more time. She had expected this. She had known, sitting in the courtroom and watching his face while the judge read the decision, that Richard Whitmore was not a man who accepted a verdict and went home. He was a man who needed the last word, even when the last word had already been given by someone with legal authority to give it. He came alone. That surprised her. No Price, no Blackwood, no hired men. Just her father on a horse arriving at the Sullivan Ranch on a gray November afternoon, and Charlotte saw him from the window and said nothing to Jack, who was in the barn, and went to the front door and opened it before he could knock. She said, "Father." He stood on the porch. He looked older than he had in the courtroom. Not dramatically older, just slightly, in the way that people look when something has cost them more than they planned to spend. He said, "I'm not here to argue." She said, "All right." He said, "The petition is finished. Price told me there are no grounds for an appeal that would succeed." She said, "I know." He said, "Blackwood is going to pursue his debt separately. I'll manage it." She said, "That was always your debt to manage." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Charlotte, I want you to understand that I believed I was doing what was best for you." Charlotte looked at her father. At this man who had shaped the first 22 years of her life with the absolute confidence of someone who never once questioned whether his version of the world was the only one. She looked at him and felt something that surprised her. Not the anger she had expected, not the grief she had been carrying for years, but something quieter than both. Something that was close to pity. She said, "I know you believe that." He said, "Then." She said, "Believing it doesn't make it true, Father." She kept her voice even, not cold. She did not want to be cruel to him. She was surprised to discover she did not want to be cruel to him. "You spent my entire life deciding what was best for me without asking me what I thought, what I wanted, what I could do. You treated me like a problem you were responsible for solving, and you solved me the way you solved everything with money and management and arrangements made in rooms I wasn't in." She paused. "I know you believed it was care, but it didn't feel like care. It felt like being managed." Her father looked at her. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know how to—" He stopped. Something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Not the controlled anger, not the performance of patience. Something underneath those things. "I don't know what I was supposed to do differently." Charlotte said, "You could have asked me." He said, "Asked you what?" She said, "Anything. What I was good at, what I wanted, what I thought about the situation we were in. You had a daughter who had been reading your contracts in secret since she was 16 and understanding them better than your lawyers, and you never once knew it because you never once asked me what I could do." Her voice was steady. "You could have asked, and I would have told you. And maybe we could have found a way out of your debt that didn't involve selling my future." The porch was very quiet. Her father said slowly, "You were reading my contracts." Charlotte said, "Since I was 16. He said, "And the accounts?" She said, "Since I was 17. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not shame exactly. Not guilt. Something more fundamental. The disorientation of a man who has been operating with a map that was wrong, who has just been shown the real one, and cannot quite process how much territory he missed. He said, "I didn't know." She said, "No, you didn't ask." He stood on the porch for a long moment. He looked at his hands. He looked at the door. He looked at Charlotte. Really looked at her. She thought possibly for the first time in years, possibly for the first time ever, without the overlay of his own plan for who she was supposed to be. He said, "Are you well?" Charlotte said, "I am." He said, "This man Sullivan, he treats you well." She said, "He treats me like a person who is capable of deciding what I need, which is what I always was." Her father nodded slowly. It was not an apology. She did not expect an apology, not yet, possibly not ever, because Richard Whitmore was not built for the kind of internal reckoning that leads to apologies, and she had made a private decision somewhere between the courthouse and this porch that she was not going to spend the rest of her life waiting for one. What she would do was live, loudly, capably, on her own terms, in a county that knew her name for what she had done, and not for who her father was. And if he ever found his way to understanding, really understanding, not just conceding she would be here, he said, "I should go." She said, "Yes." He turned to leave. Charlotte said, "Father." He turned back. She said, "The debts. How bad are they really?" He looked at her. She said, "I'm not offering to solve them. I'm asking because I'm your daughter, and I would rather know than not know." He said, "Bad enough." She said, "Can they be managed without anything like what you tried with Blackwood?" He said, "If I can restructure the northern pasture lease and sell the grain stores at spring price, possibly." Charlotte said, "The grain stores. You're holding them for spring." He said, "Yes." Charlotte said, "Don't. The spring market is going to drop. I read the commodity reports at Frank Aldrich's bank last week. Sell in the next 60 days. Her father stared at her. Charlotte said, "It's your choice. But that's what the numbers say." He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "You read the commodity reports." She said, "I read everything available to me." He put his hat on. He said, "I'll think about it." He rode away. Charlotte stood in the doorway and watched him go. She watched him until he was off the property and back on the road. And then she stood there a moment longer in the November afternoon with her hand on the doorframe and her mother's necklace at her throat. Jack came out of the barn. He walked across the yard and stopped a few feet away. He said, "How do you feel?" Charlotte thought about it. She said, tired, relieved, strangely sad. She paused. "And like I have about 4 hours of work to do before supper, and I would very much like to do it." Jack said, "The supply accounts." She said, "And the winter ledger. And I want to look at the eastern pasture lease before it renews in January." He said, "You never stop." She said, "I stopped for 22 years. I'm catching up." He looked at her with that expression she had learned, the one that was not quite a smile, not quite admiration, not quite surprise, but something made of all three. He said, "Charlotte." She said, "I know." He said, "You're extraordinary." She said, "I'm a person who does her work." She turned back into the house. "Come inside. I'll make coffee while you look at the pasture maps." He followed her. The November afternoon settled around the Sullivan Ranch, ordinary and immense, and entirely theirs. And inside, Charlotte Sullivan opened her ledger books and picked up her pen and kept building the life that no one had given her, and that no one ever again would be able to take away. The winter came hard that year. The way Wyoming winters do, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a door slamming shut on everything that came before it. And inside the Sullivan Ranch, Charlotte worked. She worked the way she had always worked, in secret, except that now the work was visible and valued, and hers in every sense of the word. The ledger books spread across the kitchen table every evening. The correspondence with Frank Aldrich about the lending records. The lesson plans she wrote out on Sunday nights for the week ahead at Dora's schoolroom. The eastern pasture lease she had renegotiated in January, quietly, carefully, with the landlord's own records in front of her, showing him exactly why the current terms were unsustainable for both parties, saving the Sullivan Ranch $400 a year going forward. Jack watched all of it with the same steady attention he brought to everything, and he said very little, which Charlotte had come to understand was not indifference, but its opposite. He was a man who showed respect by not interrupting. It was Dora who said it first. She said it on a Thursday morning in February, when the schoolroom was empty, because 3 of the children were sick with the same winter cold, and their mothers had kept them home, and Dora and Charlotte were sitting with their coffee, and the quiet that descends on a room built for noise when the noise is suddenly absent. Dora said, "You know what I've been thinking?" Charlotte said, "Tell me." Dora said, "I've been thinking that you arrived here with 1 bag and a horse and a problem, and in 4 months you have fixed the Sullivan accounts organized. Frank Aldrich's bank records settled 3 property disputes, taught 8 children things their parents had given up expecting them to learn, and renegotiated a pasture lease that has been bleeding Jack Sullivan dry for 2 years. She looked at Charlotte over her coffee cup. "And I've been thinking that this county has no idea what it has in you. And neither, I suspect, do you." Charlotte said, "I'm doing what I know how to do." Dora said, "Yes, and it turns out what you know how to do is considerable." Charlotte set her cup down. She said, "Dora, can I tell you something?" Dora said, "You can tell me anything." Charlotte said, "I spent 22 years knowing what I could do and having no place to do it. My father thought capability in a woman was a problem to be managed, so I learned to make myself small. Not stupid. I was never willing to be stupid, but small. I learned to know things quietly and use them in ways he couldn't see. I kept his accounts and never told him. I read his contracts and never told him. I understood his entire financial situation better than his lawyers did, and I sat at his dinner table and smiled and let him believe I was thinking about curtains." She paused. "I was so good at being invisible that I almost convinced myself it was the same thing as being nothing." Dora was very quiet. Charlotte said, "And then I came here, and people kept seeing me. Aldrich, Garrett, the children, you." She stopped. It's disorienting being seen after that long of being deliberately unseen. Dora said, "Disorienting good or disorienting bad?" Charlotte said, "Disorienting like being cold for so long. You forget what warmth feels like, and then stepping inside somewhere warm, and the warmth hurts for a moment before it feels right." Dora nodded slowly. She said, "That's what home does, when you find it after a long time without it." The schoolroom was quiet. Charlotte picked up her cup. She said, "I want to do more." Dora said, "More than what you're doing." Charlotte said, "More in this county, for women specifically. I keep meeting women in town, wives of ranchers' shopkeepers' daughters, who are exactly where I was. Capable of things nobody is asking them to do. Managing households, supply accounts, keeping records, making decisions that nobody acknowledges as decisions because they happen in domestic spaces." She looked at Dora. What if there was somewhere for them to learn formally accounting, record keeping, contract reading, the things that let you understand your own situation? Dora set her cup down very carefully. She said, "Charlotte." Charlotte said, "I know it's ambitious." Dora said, "I was going to say it's exactly right." Charlotte looked at her. Dora said, "I've been teaching children for 17 years because there was no one else to do it. But the women in this county, their daughters' daughters, they have nobody." She leaned forward. "What would you need to start something like that?" Charlotte said, "A room. A few evenings a week. Word of mouth." She paused. "And a partner who's been here long enough that people trust what she's attached her name to." Dora said, "Is that a request?" Charlotte said, "It's a question." Dora said, "The answer is yes." She told Jack that evening. He was at the kitchen table with the winter supply inventory when she sat down across from him and said, "I want to start a class for women in the county. Practical skills. Accounting, contracts, record keeping. 2 evenings a week at the schoolroom. Dora is on board." Jack set the inventory down. He looked at her. She said, "I know it means more time away from the ranch in the evenings." He said, "Charlotte." She stopped. He said, "Do you need money to start it?" She said, "I have some saved, from the bank work. I think I can." He said, "I have some set aside from the Eastern pasture lease savings. Take what you need." She said, "Jack." He said, "It's a good idea." "You know it's a good idea. So does Dora. So take what you need and start it." She looked at him. She said, "You don't want to know more about it first." He said, "You've been planning it for longer than tonight. If you're bringing it to me, you've already thought it through." She said, "I have." He said, "Then I don't need the details to know the answer is yes." Charlotte sat with that for a moment. The simple, unremarkable fact of a man who trusted her thinking without needing to inspect it first. She had lived 22 years in a house where every idea she had was either dismissed or redirected, or worse, absorbed into her father's plans and credited elsewhere. The plainness of Jack's trust still surprised her sometimes. She thought it probably always would. She said, "I want to pay you back, from the class fees." He said, "That's your money to decide about." She said, "Jack." He said, "What?" She said, "Stop being reasonable. It's unsettling." He picked his inventory back up. He said, "You'll get used to it." She went back to her ledger. But she was smiling at the numbers, which was something she had never done before, and she noticed it, and she let it stay. The first class met on a Tuesday evening in March. Charlotte had expected 6 women. 8 showed up. She had prepared for 8. 12 came the following week. By April, she had moved the class to the larger back room of the general store, because the schoolroom could not hold everyone, and Frank Aldrich had begun sending women there directly from the bank when they came in with questions about household accounts that he recognized were bigger questions than they sounded. The women who came were not all the same. That was the first thing Charlotte noticed, and the thing that mattered most. There were young women, daughters of ranchers barely 17, who came because their mothers sent them and stayed because something caught in them that they hadn't expected to find. There were women in their 30s and 40s who had been managing their household's finances for years without anyone calling it management, who sat down at Charlotte's instruction table and recognized in the first evening that they had been doing accounting without a name for it, and something in that recognition changed their posture. There were older women, one who was 62, who said at the end of the second class quietly to Charlotte, "I wish I had known this 40 years ago, in a way that had nothing performative in it." Charlotte taught them what she knew. She taught them the way she wished someone had taught her, not as a favor, not as something special granted to women who had earned it by being exceptional, but as a matter of course, as information they had a right to, as tools that belonged to them as much as to anyone. She taught them to read a contract. Not just the words, but the structure where the weight was, where the risk sat, which clauses transferred responsibility, and which ones created it. She taught them double-entry bookkeeping, and when a woman named Alma Garrett, Bill Garrett's daughter-in-law, 24 years old with 2 children and a husband, who let her manage the household money without fully understanding that she was actually managing it, worked through her first balanced ledger and looked up with an expression that was equal parts triumph and fury. Charlotte recognized the fury and said, "I know. It's easier than anyone let you think it was." Alma said, "Why didn't anyone teach us this?" Charlotte said, "Because the people who understood it wanted to keep understanding it alone." Alma looked at the ledger. She said, "Well, not anymore. Not anymore." Those 2 words became in Charlotte's mind the quiet motto of something she had not planned to build, but was building anyway, one Tuesday and Thursday evening at a time. The letter from her father arrived in April. It was not what she expected. She had expected more lawyers. Another attempt at something legal, or at minimum a formal communication about the state of his finances, which she had not heard about since the afternoon on the porch when she told him to sell the grain stores early. Instead, it was a letter in her father's own handwriting. 3 pages. No legal language. She read it at the kitchen table while Jack was outside. The first page was a summary of the Whitmore family finances written with a detail and honesty that her father had never in her experience applied to his own situation before. He had sold the grain stores in December, 6 weeks after Charlotte told him to. The price had been better than Spring would have given him by a margin that had combined with the pasture restructure and 3 other changes he described. Carefully, pulled the Whitmore finances back from the edge he had been standing on for 4 years. The second page was harder to read. He wrote about her mother. He had never written about her mother, had barely spoken of her since her death when Charlotte was 11. He wrote about her carefully, the way you write about something you have not allowed yourself to examine and are only now picking up and looking at in the light. He wrote that her mother had been a capable woman who had not been given the space to be capable. He wrote that he had believed when he made the decisions he made in his marriage and in his household that he was protecting the people in it. He wrote, "I have been thinking since November about the difference between protection and control. I am not certain I have understood it clearly before now." Charlotte put the letter down for a moment. She picked it up again. The third page was the shortest. It said, "I sold the grain stores as you advised. The numbers were right. I should have asked you sooner. I should have asked you about a great many things sooner. I do not expect you to forgive me quickly or at all. But I wanted you to know that I have been listening, Charlotte. Even now, especially now. Your father, Richard." Charlotte folded the letter. She sat with it for a long time. Jack came in from outside. He looked at her face. He went to the stove and made coffee without saying anything, and he put a cup in front of her, and he sat down. He said, "Bad news." She said, "No, not bad." She looked at the folded letter. "My father sold the grain stores in December. The numbers worked out." Jack said, "And?" She said, "He wrote about my mother." Jack was quiet. She said, "He said he's been thinking about the difference between protection and control." She looked at the letter. She said, "I don't know what to do with that." Jack said, "You don't have to do anything with it right now." She said, "He's not apologizing, not really. He's—" She stopped. "He's noticing, which is not the same thing, but it's more than I expected." Jack said, "Is it enough?" Charlotte said, "I don't know yet." She picked up the coffee cup. "Is it terrible that I don't know?" He said, "No." It means you're taking it seriously instead of deciding in advance. She said, I keep thinking about my mother. What she would have done if she'd had... She stopped. If she'd had a Tuesday class. Jack said, what do you think she would have done? Charlotte thought about her mother. Really thought about her. Not the blurred, grief-softened memory of childhood, but the woman herself, the things Charlotte remembered now with adult eyes. The way her mother had managed the household with quiet precision. The way she had always known things, the state of the pantry, the condition of the horses, the subtle shifts in her father's moods, and had used that knowledge to navigate to smooth, to prevent small disasters, and had never once been credited for any of it. Charlotte said, I think she would have been very good at contracts. Jack said nothing. Charlotte said, I think she would have been extraordinary. And I think she spent her whole life in the same house as a man who never knew it. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Charlotte said, I'm going to write him back. Jack said, what are you going to say? She said, I'm going to tell him about the class. I'm going to tell him what his daughter has been doing with the accounting skills she developed in secret in his house. She paused. I'm going to let him see it, all of it, and I'm going to let him decide what to do with that. She picked up her pen. She wrote the letter that evening and sent it the next morning, and she did not spend time wondering what her father would do with it. She had learned, was still learning, would probably always be learning, that the act of saying a true thing is complete in itself. What the other person does with the truth is their work, not yours. She went back to her class on Thursday evening. There were 16 women in the room. Alma Garrett had brought 2 women from the neighboring ranch, both of whom arrived skeptical and left with the particular expression of people who have just been handed something they didn't know they were missing. A woman named Clara, whose husband ran the feed store, had questions about a supply contract she'd been trying to understand for 3 months, and Charlotte walked her through it line by line. And when Clara reached the clause that had been confusing her, she made a sound that was almost a laugh and said, "That's they put it in there sideways on purpose." Charlotte said, "Yes, most of the difficult clauses are written that way on purpose. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it." Clara said, "Can I bring this contract back next week? I want to work through the rest of it." Charlotte said, "Bring it, and bring the renewal notice if you have it." Clara said, "Thank you." Charlotte said, "Don't thank me. You read it yourself. I just told you where to look." That she had discovered was the thing that mattered most. Not doing it for them. Not being the person who knew things and dispensed knowledge from above. Teaching them to read what was already in front of them. Because the information had always been available in contracts, in ledgers, in records that anyone with eyes could access. The barrier had never been access. The barrier had been the idea installed so early and so thoroughly that most women carried it without knowing it was installed, that these were not things they were supposed to understand. Charlotte's job, as she had come to see it, was not to teach new things. It was to dismantle that idea, one Tuesday and Thursday evening at a time. The twist that April brought was not the one Charlotte had expected. She had expected continued peace, or at minimum, continued forward movement. She had expected the legal situation to remain resolved, her father to remain at a careful distance, and the class to continue growing quietly. What arrived instead was Margaret Voss. The lawyer from Cheyenne appeared at the Sullivan Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon without significant warning. She had sent a letter, but it had arrived only 2 days before she did, which Charlotte suspected was deliberate, and she sat down at the kitchen table and said, "I've been hearing things about what you're doing in Clearwater." Charlotte said, "What kind of things?" Margaret Voss was 50 years old, with close-cut gray hair, and the bearing of a woman who had spent 3 decades being the only person in the room who looked like her and had decided that was the room's problem, not hers. She said, "The kind of things that come from Frank Aldrich writing to a colleague of mine in Laramie about a woman in his county who built a lending system from scratch and is now teaching contract law to ranchers' wives 2 nights a week." Charlotte said, "I'm not teaching contract law. I'm teaching contract reading." Margaret said, "That's a distinction that would interest a lawyer." Charlotte said, "Are you here to tell me the distinction matters legally?" Margaret said, "I'm here because what you're doing in Clearwater is something that 3 women I know in Cheyenne have been trying to do formally for 4 years without getting it off the ground, and you apparently did it in 8 weeks with a room borrowed from a general store. She looked at Charlotte steadily. I want to know how, Charlotte said. I started with one person I trusted. I asked for one room. I made it practical, and I didn't make it dramatic. She paused. And I didn't ask permission. Margaret said, You didn't ask permission. Charlotte said, My experience with permission is that asking for it is usually the slowest route to a no. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. She said, Charlotte, what I am about to say is going to sound larger than what you have been doing, and I want you to hear it carefully. She folded her hands on the table. Wyoming is the first territory in this country to grant women the vote. We have women in this territory who have been fighting for formal legal education access for years. What you have built here informally, practically in borrowed rooms, is what formal institutions have failed to build because they have been trying to build it from the top down. She paused. I want to talk to you about what it would take to connect what you're doing here with what is happening in Cheyenne. Charlotte sat very still. She said, What do you mean connect it? Margaret said, I mean, what if Clearwater was not the only town with a Tuesday class? The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Charlotte said, I'm one person. Margaret said, You were one person with one room 8 weeks ago. Charlotte said, I don't have the resources to. Margaret said, I do. Or more precisely, the women I work with in Cheyenne do. What we have been missing is someone who has proven it works on the ground. She looked at Charlotte. You have proven it works. Charlotte thought about Alma Garrett's face over the balanced ledger. About Clara and the sideways contract clause. About the 62-year-old woman who said she wished she had known this 40 years ago. She said, I would need to know exactly what you're proposing. Margaret said, I'm proposing a conversation, a real one, between you and me and 3 other women in Cheyenne who have resources and credentials and no proof of concept. She paused. You have the proof of concept. Charlotte looked at her. She said, When? Margaret said, Can you come to Cheyenne in May? Charlotte said, I need to talk to Jack. Margaret said, Of course. Charlotte said, And to Dora, because I won't do anything that takes from what we've built here without Dora's full agreement. Margaret said, Naturally. Charlotte said, And I want to understand the legal structure of what you're proposing before I agree to anything. Margaret said, I would expect nothing less from a woman who taught herself contract reading in secret. Charlotte looked at her. She said, Frank Aldrich has a large mouth. Margaret said, He has a deep admiration for you. It amounts to the same thing. She talked to Jack that evening. She told him all of it. Margaret Voss Cheyenne, the 3 women with resources, the possibility of something larger. She told him the same way she told him everything now, directly, completely, without softening the parts that were uncertain, or the parts that were frightening, or the parts that required something from him. He listened. When she was done, he said, Cheyenne is 2 days' travel. She said, I know. He said, How long would you be gone? She said, A week at most. I want to come back and talk to Dora before I agree to anything. He said, All right? She said, You're all right with it. He said, I told you the first week you control your own choices. What you do with your work is yours. She said, Jack. He said, What? She said, I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do, and making sure it doesn't create a problem for you that I haven't thought of. He looked at her. Something warm moved through his face. He said, There's a difference. She said, A significant one. He said, Yes, there is. He paused. Go to Cheyenne, Charlotte. She said, I intend to. He said, And when you come back, tell me everything they said. She said, Every word. He said, Good. He picked up the inventory he'd been looking at. Now can we look at the spring cattle numbers? I've been trying to get you to look at them for 3 days. Charlotte laughed. It was a real laugh, full, unguarded, the kind she had not produced in the first 22 years of her life with any regularity, because there had not been much to produce it, and now it came more easily without the effort it had once required, and she noticed this every time and was grateful for it every time. She said, Give me the numbers. She went to Cheyenne in the second week of May. She met the three women Margaret Voss had described. Their names were Helen Cross, Ruth Abernathy, and Frances Slade, and they were respectively a lawyer, a former school teacher who had become a land rights advocate, and the widow of a judge who had spent his life building legal access programs and had left her both his estate and his purpose. They were formidable. They were organized. And they had, as Margaret had said, been trying to build something on a foundation they hadn't found yet. Charlotte sat across from them at a table in Ruth Abernathy's office and laid out what she had built in Clearwater. Not proudly, not performing it. Simply describing it the way you describe a set of numbers. What she had done, how she had done it, what it had cost, what it had produced, and what she thought it needed to grow. When she finished, Frances Slade said, "How many women are in your current class?" Charlotte said, 16 regular, 4 or 5 who come when they can. Frances said, "How many could you handle if you had a proper space and a stipend for your time?" Charlotte said, "In Clearwater specifically, 30 perhaps. But the more important question is, who could replicate what I've done in other towns? Because I'm not the only person who can teach this. I'm just the person who started." Helen Cross said, "You want to train other teachers." Charlotte said, "I want to build something that doesn't depend on me." She looked at all three of them. The moment any program depends on a single person, it's one illness or one move or one life change away from disappearing. I didn't build this for Clearwater. I built it for the idea. The idea has to be bigger than me. The room was very quiet. Ruth Abernathy said slowly, "That is exactly what we have been trying to articulate for 4 years. Frances Slade said, "How old are you?" Charlotte said, 22. Frances said, "Good God." Charlotte said, "Is that a problem?" Frances said, No, it's an inspiration, which is more uncomfortable, honestly." Charlotte looked at her for a moment, and then she felt something move through her that she recognized now, the specific feeling of standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, doing exactly the work she was built to do. She had felt it the first time she balanced Jack's accounts. She had felt it when Henry Marsh got the problem right. She had felt it every Tuesday and Thursday evening in the back room of Clearwater's general store. She felt it now. She said, "Then let's build it." She came home on a Saturday afternoon to the Sullivan Ranch, and she was different from when she had left, and she knew it, and she thought Jack would see it too. He did. She walked in, and he looked at her face and said, "It went well." She said, "We have an agreement in principle. Helen Cross is drafting the formal structure. Ruth Abernathy has 3 towns in Wyoming already interested. Frances Slade is providing initial funding." She set her bag down. "We're starting in Clearwater, then expanding to 2 other counties by fall." Jack said, "You're going to be busy." She said, "I know." He said, "Busier than you already are." She said, "I know." He said, "You're going to love every minute of it." Charlotte stopped. She looked at him. She said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Good." She said, "Jack." He waited. She said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. She said, "When I arrived here, I told you I needed work, and I gave you conditions, and we shook hands across a table, and I told myself it was a practical arrangement, and I was managing my survival, and that was all it was." She paused. And that was true. For a while. The kitchen was very quiet. He said, "Charlotte." She said, "I'm not good at this part, the part that isn't numbers." He said, "You're doing fine." She said, "I don't know exactly when it changed. Sometime between the accounts and the courthouse. Or the courthouse and my father on the porch. Or the class, maybe." She looked at her hands. "Somewhere I stopped thinking of this as a place I was staying and started thinking of it as a place I was living. And somewhere I stopped thinking of you as the man who offered me a solution and started thinking of you as—" She stopped. He said, "As what?" She looked at him directly. She said, "The person I want to tell things to. Not because you need to know them, because I want you to know them." Jack Sullivan looked at her for a long moment. This man who had stood at a fence rail on a cold morning and listened to a stranger talk for 20 minutes and offered her a choice without conditions. This man who had agreed to every term she named and kept them all. This man who had stood beside her in a courtroom, and in a road, and on a porch, and had never once stood in front of her. He said, "I've wanted to tell you something since November." She said, "Tell me." He said, "The morning you rode into my yard, I thought I was helping a woman in trouble. And I was. But somewhere in the first week, I realized something had changed in this house." He paused. It wasn't louder. It wasn't more complicated. It was just fuller. Like something had been missing for years that I'd stopped noticing, and then it wasn't missing anymore. He looked at her. "And I knew it was you." Charlotte said, "You didn't say anything." He said, "You had enough to figure out without me adding to it." She said, "Jack." He said, "I know. I should have said something sooner." She said, "You said it now." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's enough." And she meant it. She meant it the way she meant everything now, completely without reservation, without the careful hedging of a woman who had learned to say only what was safe. She was done saying only what was safe. She had been done with that since midnight on a Montana road, and she was more done with it every day. She crossed the kitchen. She sat down beside him. She said, "I want to look at the spring cattle numbers tonight." He said, "Right now." She said, "And I want to talk about the eastern pasture. I have an idea about a different crop rotation that might increase the yield." He stared at her. She said, "And then I want to hear what you've been thinking about the barn roof, because I noticed last week it needs attention before next winter." He said, "Charlotte." She said, "What?" He said, "I just told you." She said, "I know what you told me. I told you what I told you. And now we're home, and there's work to do, and we have the rest of our lives to keep saying things like that to each other, so bring me the cattle numbers." He looked at her for one moment. Then he got up and got the cattle numbers, and they sat at the kitchen table in the May evening, and worked through the numbers together, and Charlotte wrote in the margins, and Jack disagreed with two of her projections, and she showed him why he was wrong about one, and conceded he was right about the other. And outside, the Wyoming evening settled over the Sullivan Ranch in the ordinary, enormous way that evenings do when they belong to you. The following year, the program that Charlotte and Margaret Voss and Helen Cross and Ruth Abernathy and Frances Slade built together opened in 7 Wyoming towns. 231 women enrolled in the first year. Charlotte trained 11 women to teach alongside her, each of them someone who had come through a class in Clearwater and discovered in themselves a capability they had been told was not theirs to have. Alma Garrett became one of the best teachers in the program. She had a way of explaining double-entry bookkeeping that was so clear and so unintimidating that even the most resistant students came around, and she did it with the specific authority of someone who had sat in that same room not long ago, certain they couldn't do it and been proven wrong. Charlotte's father wrote twice more in the year after her letter. The letters were not long. They were not full apologies. They were a man in his late 50s, beginning slowly and painfully, and with no guarantee of success, to look at the difference between what he had believed and what had been true. Charlotte wrote back both times. She was not warm in the way she had once hoped she might be allowed to be with him. But she was honest, which was its own kind of warmth, and she left the door open, which was more than she had expected to do. She left the door open because she was no longer afraid of him. And without the fear, she found something that surprised her, the capacity for patience. For letting a slow process be slow. For not needing the resolution to happen on her schedule. She had learned that from the accounts, actually. From years of understanding that some numbers only reveal themselves over time, and that forcing the reconciliation before it is ready produces worse results than waiting until the full picture emerges. Some truths are like that. You don't manufacture them. You build the conditions, and you wait, and you keep doing the work. On a morning in late October, a year and 4 months after Charlotte Whitmore had ridden through the gate of a Wyoming ranch in the pre-dawn dark with one bag and a gray mare named Agnes, and a letter she had written to herself 3 years before, that said, "Charlotte, you know what you are worth." She woke up early and lay in the quiet for a moment before the day started. The ranch was already stirring. She could hear the horses, the early sounds of a working property. The world outside the window, doing what it did, regardless of what was happening inside. She thought about the night she left. She had been so afraid. Not of what was behind her, she had known with the clarity that comes from years of preparation. What was behind her, and had already made her decision about it. She had been afraid of what was ahead, of the dark road and the unfamiliar territory, and the fact that she was moving toward a future she could not see, and had not planned, and had no guarantee of. She had been right to be afraid. It had been frightening, and it had also been the truest thing she had ever done. She got up. She dressed. She put her mother's necklace at her throat as she did every morning, because it was the one thing she had carried from her old life, and it belonged there, not as a reminder of where she had come from, but as a link to the woman who had not found her way out, and a quiet promise that what her mother had not been able to do her daughter was doing. She went to the kitchen and made coffee. Jack came in from the morning check of the horses and said, "You're up early." She said, "I've been thinking." He said, "Dangerous." She said, "About that first morning, when I rode in." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. He said, "What about it?" She said, "You looked at me and saw someone fighting for her life. That's what you said." He said, "It's what I saw." She said, "What do you see now?" He looked at her for a moment, at this woman who had rebuilt his accounts and saved his ranch and stood up in a courtroom and argued for her own existence and built a program that was teaching 200 women what they were capable of, who kept his cattle numbers on the same table where she wrote lesson plans and sent letters to lawyers in Cheyenne, who had turned a spare room into hers without announcement, and a practical arrangement into a life without plan. He said, "I see the same person, just with more room." Charlotte looked at him. She said, "That's exactly right." She picked up her coffee. She had a class to plan, letters to write, numbers to run, a barn roof to investigate before winter, a conversation to finish with Ruth Abernathy about the spring expansion, a lesson on contract reading that she was developing for the newer teachers that she thought might be the clearest version she had written yet. She had work to do, her own work on her own terms, in her own name, in a life she had built with her own hands, from the raw material of a single night when she had decided that she was not something that could be owned. Charlotte Sullivan set her coffee cup down and picked up her pen. And she got to work. Not because anyone had told her to. Not because anyone had permitted her to. Not because anyone had arranged it for her, or decided it suited them, or calculated what it was worth to them to allow it. Because it was hers. Because she was hers. And that finally, completely, irrevocably was enough.